Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from the London Fire Commissioner. So would you ask Mr. Rowe to come in, please? Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
All ready to carry on ahead?
I am, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman, good morning to you. Good morning to members of the panel. Commissioner, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I'd now like to ask you about the fire at Shepherd's Court that happened in August 2016. We heard extensive evidence from Assistant Commissioner Dan Daly in relation to that fire, and he confirmed that the fire started in a flat on the 7th floor of that purpose-built block and spread via the panels that were under the windows on the outside of the building, because those panels comprised combustible polystyrene insulation. Now, that's a very brief summary. Is there anything I've got wrong in what I've just said?
I don't believe so. I mean, I have read the post-incident report for Shepherd's Court. I wasn't in attendance at the incident, so I probably don't have the same grasp of the detail that Dan Daly would have. But yes, I think that's a useful summation of the findings of that post-incident report.
Thank you. Well, we'll come to the operational aspect of the incident later on in your evidence, but for the moment, I just want to focus, if I can, on the combustible cladding that was present on the building. Can we go, please, to RBK 000026888? This is a letter dated the 6th of April 2017, written by AC Dan Daly to Laura Johnson, Director of Housing at RBKC. It was one of a number of letters sent to directors of housing and the like across London. Is the letter familiar to you?
I have read this letter, yes.
Right. You didn't see it at the time, I imagine.
I didn't see it at the time, but I've read it as part of my preparation for the inquiry.
Thank you. Let's look at some of the key passages. If you stick with the first page and look at the second paragraph there, you see it says this. My predecessor, Assistant Commissioner Steve Chirek, wrote to housing providers in March 2009 about a variety of matters relating to fire safety in residential housing blocks. One of those matters was a replacement double glazing and the associated replacement of spandrel and filler panels on the external faces of blocks of flats with floors above 18 metres in height. In the case of this fire, we believe such panels were a contributory factor to the external fire spread. We have seen a number of cases where it appears, on the basis of the information available to us, that the level of fire protection to the external face of the building did not comply with the requirements of Part B of the building regulations, insofar as they seek to limit the speed at which a fire can travel and spread over the external face of a building or may contribute to a fire. Testing of panels has found that the combustibility of the composition of the panels at Shepherd's Court did not meet the levels expected for conformity with the building regulations. On testing, it was found that panels may deform or delaminate, exposing any combustible core or constituent material, resulting in the panel becoming involved in the fire and allowing the fire to spread and enter flats other than the flat of origin of the fire. Now, first, Commissioner, would you agree that the Shepherd's Court fire involved, in fact, precisely the same issue that presented itself at Lakenal House and then presented itself later that year at Grenfell Tower?
Yes, very similar, because both in the case of the Lakenal House fire and the Shepherd's Court fire, the use of spandrel panel infill panels was an issue, and the spread of fire in the context of those panels was an issue.
Yes.
I think more obviously at Shepherd's Court.
Exactly, thank you. Yes, and the core point here being the commonality between the fact that they were non-compliant and combustible facade panels. Yes?
Oh, apologies, yes.
Yes. Yes. Now, leaving aside the question of degree, extent of external fire spread that resulted by reason of those panels, and also ignore the fact that Grenfell was fully clad rather than having simply spandrel squares of facade, do you agree with me that the point being made here was that the fire had spread as a result of the use of non-compliant construction materials on the exterior of a residential high-rise block? Same issue at Lakenal and same issue later that year at Grenfell. That's the point I'm seeking to.
In the context of Shepherd's Court, yes, absolutely. The external fire spread was a significant contributing factor. In the context of Lacanau, whilst the external infill panels were certainly a contributory factor, I think, as we discussed yesterday, the very serious failures of internal compartmentation were as much to blame for the very rapid and unexpected fire spread at Lacanau. But there is a commonality across both fires, but to a greater extent at Shepherd's Court.
Yes, and would you agree that it would follow from that the more panelling you've got, the greater the risk of extensive external fire spread?
Yes, particularly if the scope of that panelling, the extent of that panelling was co-joined and continuous.
Yes, and therefore I think you would agree the greater the risk of fires breaking back into compartments.
Should non-compliant material have been used in the construction of the facade? Yes, because inevitably there were more points of intersection via window frames or other joints in the building to the interior of the building, yes.
Can we please then go back to the Module 6 written opening submission at LFB 001 23263. And if we look together, please, at page 2, paragraph 6, you see there, the paragraph begins, by the time of the fire at Shepherd's Court in August 2016, the LFB were aware of the dangers of certain types of modern external wall systems, such as rain screen cladding, but the extent and wider impact of those systems, which were seen in the Grenfell Tower fire, was not fully understood. Now, I just want to ask you about the second part of that sentence there. Can you explain what is meant by the statement that the extent and wider impact of certain external wall systems was not fully understood?
I think what that means is that the building industry had moved more quickly than the London fire. So its use of modern methods of construction, a variety of materials in facades, whether it was actually wooden cladding or whether it was manufactured composite materials, aluminium, clad composites, I think we were beginning to understand that modern methods of construction and the kind of innovative use of materials was outstripping our ability to always not even just understand, but even know what people were using, and that we were coming across some very odd examples of exterior fire spread. So, for example, the Mandarin Court Hotel was a 20-pump fire where an external living wall spread fire from basically the ground floor to the top floor of the hotel because of the plastic mesh that sat behind the living wall. Now, this was not something we'd seen before, and now we were suddenly seeing living walls on a scale adorning the size of commercial and indeed even residential buildings. So there's something about the pace at which the building industry was moving compared to our complete understanding of how people might be using all sorts of facade materials, connecting them together and using them in combination with other elements of construction to finish a building. So I think it's about our ability to keep pace with the building industry.
Right, just on that, just help me. The Mandarin Court Hotel, am I right in thinking post-dated the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, it did.
It was something like 2018, wasn't it?
I think it was something like that, yes.
Do you know, from your knowledge now, what the fire safety department within the LFB at the time knew of the method of construction which you've just described, so plaster over mesh, and its combustibility?
I couldn't tell you what they knew exactly at that point. I would be surprised if colleagues in fire safety engineering, our fire engineering experts, didn't have some awareness of construction of that nature, because I think they're very well-trained professionals who work very hard to kind of try and keep abreast of all the different developments in the construction industry. But I can't speak to the detail of it because I don't know.
Right. I mean, from the time you became Commissioner in January 2020, have you done anything to have a look at the Fire Safety Department, even as a silo, and ask it whether it was keeping up with modern methods of construction, such as the example you've just given us?
Yes. So myself, the Deputy Commissioner, Richard Mills, Paul Jennings, who is our current Assistant Commissioner for Fire Safety, have regular conversation about how the built environment is developing. I have a monthly catch-up actually specifically to deal with emerging issues in fire safety. So myself and the DEP sit with the the AC outside of any formal board structures. Fire safety is an agenda item in the cross-cutting operational corporate board. So we come back to it again and again. It's how I know about the battery issue, because although that's really quite niche, batteries on a scooter, as we discussed yesterday, is something that's filtered up and through and was brought to my attention in one of the monthly updates. So we keep on coming back to it. But it is a challenge, because the building industry is doing things that, I think are to be admired for their innovation, but at times do need to be challenged for their kind of prioritisation of fire safety. So, for example, in Croydon, and forgive me, I don't know the exact detail, it's either under construction, has had the planning approved, or is in construction. I'm waiting for an update. Well, we are building the tallest ever building constructed with shipping containers. And the question my fire engineers have is the frame that sits beneath those shipping containers able to withstand the corrosive effects of a very high temperature fire, for example? But, to be fair to my fire engineers, they had never come across, up until that point, the possibility of building a 44-storey tower out of shipping containers. So I think London is right to be proud of the innovation that its construction industry demonstrates, but that does come with a challenge, and therefore we need the construction industry to place fire safety as much as a priority as they do, for example, as health and safety in construction, and think about it in terms of the value of space and what they provide inside buildings to keep their residents safe.
Coming back to Grenfell, is what you mean here in the passage that I've just read to you, that until Grenfell, the Brigade didn't anticipate that a fire could spread across the entirety of a combustible facade of a building, as opposed to being confined to a more isolated part of the facade?
No, I don't think it is saying that, because it would be disingenuous to do so, knowing that one part of the Brigade in fire safety had seen international fires where it was clear that a fire could spread across the entire facade of a building. So I think we knew it could spread across the entire facade of a building. But what our experience, even though it was, I'm afraid, contained within fire safety, had told us, was that you didn't tend to get very significant internal breach of compartmentation combined with that. So if you look at the international examples of rapid external facade spread, they're not often combined with very considerable failure of internal compartmentation. But I think we all have to acknowledge that knowledge that you could see an entire facade consumed by fire was not shared across all the bits of the organisation it should have been.
So you don't use Shepherd's Court to say, as it were, to defend the Brigade by saying, well, that was only a partial fire on the partial exterior. The Brigade knew enough to know, didn't it, at the time, that there was a real risk that a fully clad building could result in a whole building fire.
I think one part of the Brigade did, yes, certainly at that point in time.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'd like to show you the tall building slideshow that the chairman referred to yesterday during your evidence. Now, there are two versions of this, in fact, but if we look at LFB 000-32916, this is the version that we looked at phase one, although it still retains the date 13th of July 2016, which was its original date. It was updated after the Shepherd's Court fire in early October 2016. If you recall your evidence in phase one, at day 48, I think you were taken to this, and I think at that stage you said you hadn't seen it before. Looking back on it now, is that the case?
Yes, I'd not, at the point I stood in the first phase of this inquiry, I had not seen that presentation. I have since, because again I've considered it as part of my preparation for this phase of the inquiry.
Yes. Now, when you were asked about it, and just for those who want to look, it's the phase one transcript, day 48 at page 173, lines 8 to 24. And I'm going to summarise what you said there, but you were asked about this, and you said that you didn't understand at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire that new construction materials and methods were being used with limited understanding of their fire behaviour and performance, and that your base assumption was that buildings were constructed in accordance with the building regulations, which would include principles that the facade would not contribute to the fire spread itself. Does it remain your evidence as to the state of your own personal understanding as at the date of the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, because my general understanding at that point in time was that whilst I knew, because, and I said it yesterday, of my own professional interest, that we had seen, extensive facade fires abroad, I wasn't considering it in the context of the UK at that point, because we simply hadn't experienced it in quite that way, that total failure of a facade. I was fully aware that we might face external fire spread because I'd understood the lessons from Lacanau, and indeed, I know Dan Daly really well, and he talked to me about Shepherd's Call. But I have to say, and it is still a shock to me, that the scale of the failure of the British regulatory system in this regard, I was still in a place like many officers where I just don't think we anticipated failure on that scale in the British built environment.
So
rightly or wrongly, but that's my honest kind of position at that point.
Yes. Just to see if I've got that evidence correctly then, does it follow that your understanding at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire was that the risk of fire spread via an external facade system applied to certain buildings overseas, that risk, but not in England?
No, I think it was more nuanced than that. I think what I'm saying is that the totality of failure we saw, for example, in Dubai, was something that I thought was perhaps more relevant to another regulatory system, but that I was absolutely alive to the possibility of some form of external fire spread in the UK, because I'd experienced the aftermath of Lacanau and had spoken to Dan about Shepherd's Call. So it wasn't a complete, blind-sightedness on the possibility of some form of external fire spread. I'm talking about the total failure of kind of a modern method of construction in the context of facades.
Again, let me try, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but does it come to this? You looked at those overseas fires, particularly in Middle East and Europe, and said the extent of that facade fire couldn't happen here because of our regulatory regime.
I don't think it was even as concrete as that. I just don't think I suppose if the way I would have put that in my own head is I'm not sure that could happen here, because I had enough faith in the building regulatory system that I thought it wouldn't. Because I think I think again, up to the point of Grenfell, I would have anticipated partial failure of that regulatory system. Absolutely, because that's the nature of emergency services. You invariably pick up the pieces after some failure of a regulatory system. But the UK, to its credit, has a long history of actually designing and then implementing fairly robust and rational regulatory systems, and emergency services exist within that context. I think Grenfell, continues to me to be an article of public shame, really, for the United Kingdom, that a regulatory system failed so completely. So I think we all anticipated where elements of a regulatory system might not quite work, could fail because of human error or because someone had missed one part of it. But to face what was an almost complete failure of everything from design to inspection to competent construction and, frankly, good moral decision making is still really shocking. I suppose that's why I wouldn't have thought it would perhaps manifest itself in such a total way.
I was planning to take you through this slideshow piece by piece, and I will do that if I need to, but let me see if I can take this more briefly. Are you very familiar with the contents of this slideshow?
I wouldn't say very familiar, Mr. Millett. I've looked at it a couple of times in terms of preparing for the inquiry.
Very good. Well, let's just look at it then. If we turn to page 15, it says this at the very top: fire started on 7th floor in 2-bedroom flat with rapid spread of the fire along the facade. And then if we go to page 16, post-fire questions, you can see in the second bullet point there, did the facade construction contributed to the fire spread to the upper floors? And then there's an arrow. Preliminary testing was carried out and witnessed by the fire engineering group to determine the behaviour of the facade and if further actions were required. And then the presentation sets out in some detail the results of 2 series of tests that were carried out in the weeks after the fire on samples of panels taken from the scene. And if we can scroll through pages 17, 18 and 19, you'll see those there. Those are the tests, 17, 18, we can go to 18 and then 19. There they are. And if you stay on 19 and look at the photograph there, that's taken during the second series of tests. And the text on the left-hand side says, second series of tests conducted on the panel without the metal fascia. Significant sustained flaming occurring following the removal of the ignition source. Test 3 was stopped after 5 minutes, 54 seconds, as the testing facilities were overcome by the size of the fire. This series of tests revealed that the insulation contributed to the combustion when the metal fascia was removed. Next slide, 20, conclusion of the test. The tests demonstrated that once the metal fascia was removed, the insulation was contributing to the combustion process. Therefore, the facade may have contributed to the fire spread. And then next page, 21, general conclusion. And I think we did look at this at your phase 1 evidence. But note the bold in the original text. And it says this: as a general principle in bold, the external envelope of the building should not contribute to the fire spread along the facade. New construction material and method of construction are being used in facades and with a limited understanding of their fire behaviour / performance. There is a need to understand what products are being used in the facade system and their fire behaviour, and if they are used appropriately and meet the relevant guidance. These could affect the way fires develop and spread in a building. Now, we know that this same presentation also includes various different items of technical information from the regulatory guidance, and I can just give you a quick example of that. If you go to page 5 in the same document, back at page 5, external fire spread, what are the issues on the right-hand side? And you can see that the top left of the text is a diagram, and in the red box, rapid fire spread, it says cladding system contributes. Can you just see that? Cladding system contributes to flame spread, resulting in risk of multiple simultaneous secondary fires. And then underneath that, there is a diagram or image taken, in fact, from the 2013 edition, third edition of BRE 135. BR 135. I'm going to assume that you weren't familiar with that technical data, or perhaps you were.
No, I wasn't.
No. And then you can see, if you go to the next slide. Sorry, stay on this. I'm so sorry. That it'll work on both slides, but go back to page 5. That was too quick. On the left-hand side of the diagram, you can see a large orange arrow and some text next to it, which says, if the external cladding contributes to the flame spread, there is a risk of secondary fire spread to all levels. You see that?
I do.
And then on the right-hand side, the same escape of fire from the window to the facade. But on that side, in the top right-hand corner of the diagram, in the red box, it says, restricted fire spread. Cladding system does not contribute to flame spread. Risk of secondary fires limited. And then in the next slide at 6, you've got the same arrow, which is the vertical mechanisms of external fire spread, and there are the factors set out: combustible materials in the facade system, cavities, part of system as a result of construction defects created by delamination. Note, flames in cavities can extend 5 to 10 times original length regardless of materials present. So that tells us, and we can read it, that the risk exists that combustible materials might be used in a facade system, and also the risk that cavities exist, whether intentionally or by a result of a defect, yes?
Absolutely, yes.
There's then some technical material set out on pages 7, 8, and 9, and 10, which is essentially approved document B, technical guidance note 18, which I needn't trouble you with, the second edition from June 2015, and BR 135. I don't need to take you to that because you're not familiar with the technical material, but would you agree on what I've shown you, that this presentation demonstrates a detailed and pretty sophisticated level of technical understanding of the risks of facade fires in the built environment, at least on the part of LFB's Fire Safety Department?
Yes, I would. And I think, and again, it speaks to the points I made yesterday, that one of the things we should have done better was to ensure that knowledge was shared with all the other relevant parts of the organisation. I think that is clear and indisputable.
Yes. And do you agree that that would also show that the LFB was aware, at least within the fire safety department, particularly as a result of the actual tests done on the facade panels from Shepherd's Court, that external fire spread through the mechanism of a burning facade system was something that could happen here?
Yes, I think it would be hard not to draw that conclusion, particularly in the context of the effects of delamination and the spread, inside a cavity of flames of a far greater size.
And that in essence, perhaps this is too subtle a reading of the slideshow, but in essence, the regulatory regime in England did not obviate, or did not always obviate, the risks giving rise to the mechanisms of external fire spread demonstrated by this slideshow.
No, I would agree with that. So I think that it was clear that if those methods of construction were likely to be encountered in the built environment, and we had recognised that risk inside our own fire safety department, there has to be a question about the regulatory system that would perhaps allow that to occur. And when I talk about a regulatory system, I think we have to think about it both in terms of base principle, but the process that regulatory system frames, from design through inspection to construction and the signing off of construction. And in particular, I've had an interest, obviously, since the fire in how the industry and those that regulate the building industry test things in composite, because it's not enough to just test things in individual isolation to test a panel. You've got to almost build a wall with all the elements behind it to really understand how a building might operate in its total nature.
Yes, and I think you might be referring to, perhaps unwittingly, to BS 8414 parts 1 and 2.
I'm not sure I've got the detail of the relevant British standard, I'm sorry.
Right. But do you accept this point as a serious point, that the extent of the wider impact of the type of external wall system was fully understood before the Grenfell Tower fire, as demonstrated by this slideshow?
I think within our fire engineering department and in fire safety, there was without a doubt a growing understanding that composite wall panels, however they were used, whether as infill or in extension across a whole facade, presented the very real danger of external fire spread. It is obvious from this presentation.
And are you able to explain, looking back on it now from the position you occupy as Commissioner, how it came about that detailed technical information and the knowledge of those risks, as shown by this document, remained siloed within the fire safety department and were never disseminated to frontline firefighters?
I would break it into three factors, and this is obviously my perspective. I wasn't there at the time. I can't speak to the decision making at my level then, but I would break it down into culture, the pressure of what people in what is a relatively small fire engineering department for the environment, fantastic people, world-class engineers actually, but the scale of what they were having to deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of the volume and complexity of consultations, and then back to governance again. So not having the governance that supported senior leaders to effectively put them in a place where they had to work across the boundaries of departments and directorates. So partly this thing about everyone having their head down, working really hard, a culture of kind of focusing on your area of business that had grown over many years, the governance that would have better supported people to break out of their department or directorate to share information because they were mandated to. And then actually, if I think about fire safety in particular, the very real pressures that, whilst we have the largest fire engineering team in the UK, and rightly so, if I think about just the high-rise environment alone, there are 12,000 high-rises in the UK. I've just had the update from the Building Risk Review this morning. Over the course of the pandemic, we have inspected 8,500 of those high-rises in London. We have 8,500 of the 12,000 residential high-rises in the UK in London. That is disproportionate compared to anywhere else in the UK. Manchester, the next largest conurbation, which equates to about a third of the population of London, has only 500 residential high-rises. That is 100 less than Westminster, which has 600 high-rises as a borough alone. So that fire engineering department is dealing with a moving landscape, a built environment that is on an exponential scale beyond anything else experienced in the UK, and actually pretty much worldwide. It's only the other global cities that stand in comparison. So I have some sympathy for the fact that they will have known this, would have focused on it, and then would have relied at someone at a more senior level to pass the information across through good governance, which I'm afraid was not in place at that time.
Yes, let me come back to that answer in due course. But let's proceed. Let me show you something, which is Andy Jack's witness statement, which he provided to the inquiry, and is easier, I think, if I go to it. It's LFB 001200308, and there are two passages I just want to show you. The first is on page 4. And I'm sure you're familiar with who Andy Jack is.
I am indeed.
Yes. And he says at page 4, in paragraph 14, he says in the second line, the adequacy of the ADB in respect of B41, that's external fire spread, was a live issue for the investigation of offences in respect of Lakenal House and during the preparation for and the hearing of the Lakenal House inquest. Certainly following the Lakenal inquest and the Rule 43 recommendations made by the coroner on 28 March 2013, it was a commonly held view at the LFB that the guidance to B41 was insufficiently clear. And then if you go to page 7, please, and let's look together at paragraph 24 at the foot of that page. And this is under the heading, The Misinterpretation of B4 in the Residential Construction Industry and Practice. At the time of the email exchange between myself and colleagues on the fire safety and fire engineering teams, and this I think is 2012, it was a commonly held view at the LFB that there was widespread misunderstanding by building control bodies and industry stakeholders of the scope of B41 as it applied to the regulations governing spread of fire over the surface of a building, and that this misunderstanding was fostered by a lack of clarity within the guidance. This is evident from the letters of the then Commissioner Ron Dobson to the DCLG on the 11th of December 2012 and the 26th of September 2013. Now, that's what he said. My question is, were you aware at the time, or are you aware now that it was a widespread view at the time, that B4, external fire spread, within ADB was unclear or generally misunderstood?
I think you have to view this from the perspective of Andy Jacks. So Andy Jacks is a preeminent fire safety expert. He's an excellent officer who offers, I think, real value to the national landscape and understanding of fire safety. But he is very focused on fire safety. I think when he talks about widespread understanding, my reading of this document would be that he's talking about the fire safety department. He's talking about colleagues in fire safety, and he's talking perhaps singularly of the commissioner, who obviously may have been briefed on that matter. I certainly did not have that understanding at that point in time, and I would suggest that the majority of other operational officers did not share that understanding of approved document B. To answer the second part of your question, am I aware now? Yes, I'm very aware of approved document B, and I find it to be somewhat impenetrable. And I think that as part of the outfall of this inquiry, I would hope that we, along with the legislation that is going to come to pass through government, we improve on the guidance that is available to the building industry in regard to fire safety generally.
Yes. Now, I think thus far, you would agree with this, I think, that it was very much on the LFB's corporate radar, if I can put it that way, that the assumption that materials on the outside of a high-rise building did not pose a fire risk by virtue of our regulatory regime was an unsafe assumption.
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
I'll put it differently. The LFB knew as a corporate entity that they could not assume that materials on the outside of high-rise buildings didn't pose a fire risk because they complied with the regulatory regime.
It's clear from the letters from people of Dan Daly's seniority, the letters from the Commissioner to various parties, and obviously the understanding held within fire safety that was the case, yes.
And do I take it that you would agree that, at least in some form, that critical information should have been placed into the minds of first responders, watch managers, crew managers attending a fire?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes. Now, I just want to show you something that's a little bit later in time, early June 2017, a matter of weeks only before the Grenfell Tower fire itself. LFB 000-24271. This is a presentation dated June 2017, created by Kevin Hughes, who has some qualifications after his name, who I think at the time was a DAC. From what we can see, it was drafted a little earlier in 2017, but it's dated to June of that year, and it's entitled Firefighting in Tall Buildings, and it's a set of conference notes, as you can see from the first line of the text. If I take you to slide 8, you can see where we start with a particular building. This is another interesting incident, says the text. The picture shows the fire service tackling a small fire on the 10th floor. And you can just see 2 firefighters, I think, on the balcony there. If you go to page 9, there's a bit more detail. Fire on 10th floor, with the red arrow. Here we see a close-up of the building, the top of the penthouse flat on the 10th floor. What is really interesting about this is that the fire actually started at the ground floor and progressed from the ground floor to 10 floors up, all behind the cladding in a very short space of time. And then slide 10, please. Point of ignition at street level. This slide shows the point of ignition at the ground floor. The fire was started by careless disposal of smoking material. And then if you go to slide 11, how the fire travelled, the cause, and there's some red arrows there. The slide shows how the fire travelled from street level to the 10th floor. Flammable building facades are a common challenge for the LFB, and we'll need to scroll down. Thank you. They cause unexpected fire spread, sometimes unseen until it breaks out again in a different location, and they often lead to fire breaking out on several floors. These type of fires can really challenge the fire strategy of a tall building. In residential buildings, the fire is not confined to the flat of origin, and our stay-put limited evacuation strategy is compromised. Large-scale evacuations in residential buildings, especially those with single staircases, cause a problem in terms of staircase capacity and obstruction to firefighters. And then there's something about commercial buildings, we can skip over that. And then in the penultimate paragraph, the reason for highlighting this is to raise awareness of the problem. I believe that the codes and fire engineering principles we use to design fire safety into buildings are excellent, but facade fires and uncontrolled spread of fire across the outside of tall buildings is a significant threat to the effectiveness of many systems within the building. This is a vulnerability that we can design out of buildings by ensuring the limited combustibility of facades, and where any doubt exists at the design or specification stage, we should be seeking independent testing of facade materials to provide assurance that they are of limited combustibility. Now, one can summarize it this way. Do you accept that here, as at June 2017, a week or two before the Grenfell Tower fire, the LFB as a corporate entity knew, first, that flammable or combustible building facades were a common challenge for the LFB?
I think this presentation is an example of 2 things. Firstly, I'm not sure it's a particularly good presentation, because I think the example that's been given there is actually speaks to the failure of compartmentation and avoid behind a facade, because it starts behind a facade and then it comes out much later. And actually, we did have experience of that over many years. You know, I'd been at a 15 pump fire in Hounslow years and years before, where a poorly constructed timber frame building, a fire had started in one corner near a car park and ended up diagonally, almost 20 metres away at another corner of a building, leading to partial collapse. We've known about the danger of unexpected fire travel in voids for years, and indeed instructed people on it. So in that sense, the example itself is slightly erroneous, because I don't believe it was the facade that was actually the primary causation here. It was the poor application of fire breaks behind the facade that would have created the conditions Kevin Hughes has described there. The second part of it, and I think this does point to a real issue for LFB, by the way, so I'm not seeking to mitigate this presentation, is that you have an example of an officer there at a senior level working within a fire safety department, going to a conference to present on behalf of LFB. I'm not sure how cited the people who led him at the time were on that presentation. So that's someone speaking on behalf of the London Fire Brigade, perhaps without having had the oversight to have that point of view either challenged or clarified or considered in the round. And I think it speaks to this issue of joining things up again, about one part of the organisation knowing what the other part of the organisation is doing. Because, it speaks to that, to me, as much as anything, this presentation.
Well, I'm just really going on the words on the slide. Do you accept that flammable building facades were a common challenge for the LFB?
Not in our experience in terms of volume, no, not up to that point. We certainly, again, it would be completely wrong in the context of this inquiry to pretend it wasn't known as an issue for the London Fire Brigade. It's clear from the letters that Ron Dobson had sent, that Dan Daly had sent, the knowledge contained within the specialist fire engineering department, that we knew about the risk. But in terms of actually having experienced fires where there was significant involvement of flammable cladding, I think our experience was fairly limited. It wasn't in the wider knowledge as the major contributory factor in terms of risk at a high-rise fire. Even at that point, it still wasn't. So I think the use of the word common is erroneous because, again, I don't believe the knowledge that people like Kevin Hughes had, who, to his credit, is a very experienced fire safety inspecting officer and specialist, I do not believe that knowledge was shared. So when they talk of common understanding, I'm afraid people like Andy, Jax and Kevin are perhaps talking about the common understanding within that section of professionals within the London Fire Brigade. And again, that knowledge wasn't perhaps shared effectively because it would not have been the common experience or understanding of most operational crews and officers.
Well, that I understand.
Yeah.
That's what I'm really seeking to understand why that was. But going on what we see on the slide, do you accept, looking at the third and fourth paragraphs down, that, and I'm summarising, a flammable building facade can really challenge the fire strategy of a tall building?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
And that in residential buildings, the fire is not always confined to the flat of origin, and the stay-put strategy may well be compromised.
Absolutely, because again, whilst we hadn't trained firefighters and officers effectively to understand how they might reverse that strategy, we had, of course, referenced it in our own high-rise policy for a number of years. We had been part of the formulation of the National Generic Risk Assessment. It was clear that that was a possibility. It was a possibility that was known in the London Fire Brigade.
Yes. And as he says, facade fires and uncontrolled spread of fire across the outside of tall buildings was a significant threat to the effectiveness of the many systems within the building.
Yes, I couldn't dispute that.
Yes. And again, is the reason why, as at June 2017, that knowledge was not in the heads of your watch managers or above, any of whom could be called upon at an incident at a high-rise in London at any time, but sat siloed in a coterie of fire safety officers.
Yes, and the shame of it is that this would be a useful presentation to give to watch officers and operational officers. I think that is the point, is that we knew this. We were giving it to a conference of people who also had a right to be interested and deserved to have that knowledge shared with them, but we had not given this presentation simply to our own wider operational staff.
And leaving aside whoever was responsible for the undertaking, a massive evacuation of a residential high-rise building was always on the cards.
It had always been considered as a possibility, but we had not trained people to undertake it. It was recognised. It was recognised within the GRA. It was referenced, briefly within our own policy. So that recognition was there. But I think perhaps we had always avoided tackling that as a training issue because of the very real difficulties in training to that possibility, because it is challenging. We're training to that now. So if I think about what we're doing now, that is what we are doing now. We are training firefighters to carry out mass emergency evacuation, the transition from evacuation to mass rescue. And I have to say, we found it enormously challenging. It is of note to me that the governmental working party drawn together to consider this very issue has sat for a number of years since the fire without producing any guidance for either the National Fire and Rescue Service nor other parties who might be interested. We've had to do this on our own in partnership with NFCC. We've had to consider how we might reasonably train firefighters to carry out what is an enormously difficult process at the point you're confronted with it. Because obviously we are doing it in buildings that are simply not designed for that purpose. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We must do it, and we are doing it, but it's extraordinarily difficult.
Just on that, then, can you just break that up a little bit? First of all, on training generally, is Babcock still the contracted outsourcee?
It is, yes. So Babcock is still our outsourced training provider for those elements of centrally delivered training. But can I just make the point that, and I think there is a great focus on the contractor, but the reality is that 90%, both in terms of volume and syllabus of training, is delivered by junior officers to their watches on our fire station. So whilst I have a real interest, obviously, in the performance of our contractor and the training outcomes we see, I have as great an interest in the support we give our junior officers and the syllabus we provide for them and the materials we provide for them on fire stations, because that is where the bulk of the training actually lies, which is not the responsibility of the contractor.
As a separate, or perhaps parallel point, let me just explore this with you. You'll have heard, or perhaps seen some of the evidence earlier in this module about the way in which training gets conceived of, perhaps as a response to a trend identified in the DOT process, and then goes through the operational news process, and then turns into a TCAP, and various things then happen. That process, of which we've heard so much, was in place up to 2017. What is the process now by which training, such as training firefighters to instigate a mass evacuation, is now designed and delivered?
I think rather than sort of focus on the nomenclature of it, so I think it would probably still be called the training, commissioning, and application process, so the TCAP process. But it's about the nature of the bureaucracy that surrounds that. So where we've got to now is a manifestly rationalised process, so slimmed down, so that we put commissioning officers much closer to the contractor, or actually step into a space where we co-create, because we recognise that it's much easier for a fire and rescue service to maintain contemporary experience of a very rapidly developing risk environment than it is for a third-party contractor, and therefore we've got a responsibility as an intelligent client to bring that knowledge to bear in the commissioning of training. So we've rationalised the process, we've slimmed it down. I think it needs to be improved further. I think it needs to become, agile further still, but that's a shared responsibility between us and the contractor.
And what sort of time frame now would you be looking at between identifying the need for training on a particular activity and rolling it out to station-based staff?
I wouldn't have a fixed period of time, because I think it's dependent on your assessment of risk. If we discovered a risk that was so paramount that we needed to do something quickly and effectively, we would prioritise on that basis. But I suppose the reality of training 5,000 staff with their availability in the context of the ships means that it normally takes about a year. Your prime example of that would be what we've done around high-rise, actually. We recognised, at the point I took over in January 2020, that we simply had to bring into operation vastly altered operational policies in respect to fire survival guidance, evacuation and high-rise firefighting, which had to be seen together, so couldn't be seen as individual policies, must be seen together, understood together, used together. It took us a year to commission and deliver in totality the training to all 5,000 of our operational staff, and we're now into the second round of validation and test by exercise of that process, and we will have to evolve it again because of the research we are leading on around firefighting in the high-rise environment. We'll have to change again. We'll have to go back round and round again. So I think when we want to, we can flex that contract very quickly. For example, if I think about a separate occurrence around training, one of the rightly critical findings, the causes of concern that came out of our 2019 inspection, was the volume and quality of our incident command training. we went back to the contractor and changed the syllabus within a matter of weeks, and have delivered a completely different approach to revalidation, again, over the same time period. Over the course of a year, we got to all our operational leaders and either validated them or gave them a different form of acquisition training if they were stepping into that role. So I think the contract can be made to work for us on the basis of risk, but it requires, a robust relationship with the contractor. It requires us to take our responsibilities seriously as the intelligent client, as the person commissioning the training. But my personal focus is not really on the mechanism by which we get to the outcome. It is the outcome itself. I think you can reasonably consider in-sourced and outsourced solutions to training. In fact, we deliver on a hybrid model in a number of places now, and the contractor is entirely comfortable with that, as are we. It's about getting the right outcome for firefighters so that the people of London get the right outcome.
And are you able to explain why it took an incident like Grenfell Tower for the Brigade so radically to revamp its training processes?
I'm afraid I can't, because I wasn't at that level of decision-making or relationship with the contractor. I can only speak to my own relationship, which is professional, courteous and robust. I meet with the CEO of Babcock fairly regularly. We have quarterly meetings at director and commissioner level with our relevant other parties within Babcock. And to be fair, it is at times a challenging relationship, as it should be. We challenge each other back and forth as to each other's responsibilities and what we expect to see as a quality of outcome.
No, what I'm really driving at is something different, which is there were 8 years between Lakanal and Grenfell, and some recommendations which came from the coroner at Lakanal, which resulted in training, for example, incident command, which we've heard a lot of evidence about. Are you able to tell us, from your perspective as Commissioner now, why it took Grenfell to revamp, say, radically your training programme, and that radical revamping wasn't done when it became obvious that training was not being rolled out quickly in the light of the Lakanal recommendations?
Again, I'm not sure from my position now, looking back, and we have looked at, obviously, our training with some rigour and continue to. We're just coming to the end of another review of all our training processes. It's hard to pinpoint, again, a single factor. I think there was a challenge in the transition from a very large in-sourced training model to a very large outsourced training model. Just the transition process, I remember it being challenging. I think there will have been something around how the organisation culturally accepted the move to an outsourced training model, perhaps elements of resistance potentially within it, an ideological basis to resist that. There is likely to have been the challenge actually of just starting something new and then working to evolve it, because I can see that, even prior to me taking over as Commissioner, the development of training in partnership with Babcock had got better from a starting point. So there had been attempts to evolve it. But to be frank, Grenfell was, and rightly so, was an enormous shock to the London Fire Brigade. It painted a stark picture. So I think recognising it as the catalyst for change is appropriate, because it should have acted as a catalyst for change. It was the most terrible reminder, as I said yesterday, for any institution that should have been there in place supporting the bereaved, the residents of that block, that we needed to make change.
And this brings me to one of the questions I started yesterday with, which was, why wasn't Lakanal the catalyst for change, given that there were 6 deaths and it was a defining moment in the Brigade's history?
I think that it was a catalyst for change. I think we saw a great energy immediately after the fire to bring change. I saw the same energy immediately after 7/7, which was equally traumatic for the Brigade, and equally difficult in terms of some of the things we'd exposed firefighters to and what we saw it do to communities in London generally. Again, there was a great energy after 7/7 to learn the lessons. I think what I come back to is the same point I made yesterday. And it's the thing I think I have the greatest responsibility to try and change and embed now, is the ability to sustain the lessons and the change generationally, to keep on coming back to it and really unpicking, in the kind of total nature of it, what those lessons mean. So I think Lakanal was a catalyst for change. I think that 7/7 was a catalyst for change. I think 9/11 was a catalyst for change. But in each of those cases, it was about then sustaining the lessons that that generation of officers had learned and bringing it forward. And I think that's where I would suggest our greatest vulnerability was exposed.
Let's then turn to Lakanal, and I want to examine with you how the Brigade, in fact, implemented the Lakanal Coroner's recommendations from 2013 onwards. And let's start with incident command training. We've already touched briefly on the recommendations in the context of the Lakanal House study. I'd like to take you to the recommendations. Let's look at the coroner's letter, LFB 000-32158. This is the letter to the LFB of the 28th of March 2013, addressed to the then Commissioner Ron Dobson. And if we go, please, to page 3, we can see the 7 recommendations relating to incident command at the top of the page. She says, it is also recommended that the consideration be given to training of ICs and potential ICs to enhance their performance in relation to the following. And there are 7 bullet points set out there. The third bullet point says, to anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. Now, first, would you agree that this recommendation was, one can presume, born out of the rapid, unexpected and widespread failure of compartmentation at Lakanal?
Yes.
Yes. And that recommendation essentially went to the need to prepare commanders to face the risk of building failure?
Yes, that's certainly the understanding I had taken from the fire itself.
Yes. Now, we've heard a lot of evidence so far about the internal processes and systems that were put in place by the Brigade after the inquest to address this and other recommendations. Now, our understanding, and please correct us if this is wrong, is that you were not personally involved in any of those internal processes. Is that right?
No, the only intersection I had with any of the post-Lakanal kind of desire to improve was the use of an exercise that we had set up anyway in Southwark, and then became clearly an opportunity to test a revised high-rise firefighting policy at the time. So that was my only real knowledge and involvement with any part of that process. And that was only as an exercise facilitator, so the person who had ensured we had enough fire engines there, that we had a suitable venue for it, that I joined all the different parts of the kind of machine up to enable that exercise to happen on the day.
Was that the Haygate Challenge of 16th of June 2011?
Yeah.
Right. That's before the inquest itself?
Well, there you are. I think that probably demonstrates to you that I'm not connecting the time up in the right way. So that is my only involvement actually in that.
Right. Well, with that in mind, I'm not going to ask you about any of those processes, but what I do want to explore with you is the training that ultimately emerged specifically in response to these 7 recommendations on incident command, namely, in a very focused way, the package called Holcroft House. Are you familiar, Commissioner, with the Holcroft House package?
Not in intimate detail, but I recognise the title. I will no doubt have read it as part of the preparation for the inquiry again.
Right. Well, let's see how we go. Can we go to BAB 6011, please? Now, here is the first page of the training guide for the Holcroft House CDE, or Command Decision Exercise. This is undated, I should tell you, but this is the training guide for crew and watch manager. Just looking at the document on your screen, are you familiar with it, do you think?
I'm not sure, to be frank. I mean, I recognise the branding of it, and I've read so many documents now that are training materials provided to our officers and crews, but I think as we move through it, I may become more familiar with it.
Right.
I think I'll probably recognise it from the detail of the package itself.
Right, okay. Well, we understand that it wasn't finalised until August 2016, by which time you were a DAC. Do I take it from what you've just told us that, notwithstanding that, you have no recollection of undertaking the Holcroft House exercise yourself?
I don't think so, no.
Right. Well, we've looked at the detailed content of this package with other witnesses before you in this module, including former Commissioner Danny Cotton. So I'm not going to go through it with you, but I'd like to look at put some headline points to you and see if you can respond. This exercise, first, do you know, involved only very limited compartmentation failure, in that the fire was said to have spread from the corridor on the 4th floor to a single flat on the 4th floor.
No, I wasn't aware of that.
I mean, I can show it to you in the document at page 76, if we just go to that. You weren't aware of that, you say?
No.
And there it is on the in the first box there as an inject. It didn't involve any external fire spread, whether as a result of non-compliant panels or otherwise, and that is absent from the entire document. It referred only in passing to the need to consider full or partial evacuation, with no guidance as to how it should be carried out or at what point. I can show you that if we go first to page 6. You can see there in the last paragraph under 1.4 that the incident increases in complexity to involve persons reported, fire survival calls, significant fire growth and mass evacuation compounded by the hazards and risks associated with the remedial building works. This will create significant challenges for CM and WM delegates. And then page 69, we see how the package actually addresses that issue, particularly mass evacuation. And at 69, under the heading Collective Evidence of Performance, Trainer Assessment, Holcroft House Inject, number 7, and then the fourth red box down, consider partial or evacuation of block. That's it. And only one FSG call on page 12. And just to remind you, Lakanal had 5. Now, on the assumption that what I have described to you in this package is fair and accurate, on that assumption, would you agree that that exercise scenario omits critical features of the Lakanal House incident, not least 1, rapid and widespread failure of compartmentation, 2, extensive fire and smoke spread, and 3, an appropriate number of FSG calls?
Yes, but then I think my question in return would be, at what point in the learning cycle of a watch officer is this exercise carried out? Because I think when you've got new officers, you've obviously got to build their knowledge and exposure to stress over time. So if this was one of the earlier exercises they were exposed to, where you're starting to build their confidence, starting to get them to think about some of the decisions they might have to make, although I would like to see more guidance, obviously, about what partial or full evacuation might even mean, then it might be appropriate. But you would expect it to be followed reasonably, knowing the lessons from Lakanal, with something more complex, delivering a greater level of pressure, with more guidance around how you might deal with multiple points of failure and the challenges, the very real challenges of evacuating, in the context of an emergency or block.
Well, we haven't seen any other package that would have created the bedrock training about how to go about or when to go about a partial or full evacuation of a block, or how to identify sudden impending fire growth.
I'm not sure it existed, and the reason I know that is because obviously I have, as Commissioner, gone back, not personally to unpick every single detail of training. I wouldn't be able to do that in my role. I don't think you'd reasonably expect that. But we have set people about the task of obviously completely revising our training syllabus, and we do now train in a very different way, face-to-face, incident commanders to take exactly those decisions with the guidance as to how they might carry out that enormously difficult task. And now we put them into a simulated environment. We're in the process of running a series of very challenging 12-pump exercises for every single firefighter and officer in London to take those decisions, not in the environment of a decision-making exercise in a classroom, but inside a tower block with a simulated incident underway, evacuating people from the block. So I think the fact that we've gone back, and I can see that we haven't got that depth of training, and we've brought into operation a completely different syllabus around high-rise firefighting, which we will need to continue to build on. We anticipate, if we secure the investment and we get the right balance of resources in place, that we will need to deliver a repeated kind of cycle of what we're going to call an urban firefighting course, so a week's residential course away, probably at somewhere like the Fire Service College or one of the other training centres in the country that allow for realistic carbonaceous burn. And I expect every firefighter to have that, ideally on a yearly basis, or at the very least on a 2-yearly basis, where we start to embed that learning in a very realistic simulated environment. So it's not that I'm even satisfied with where we've got to now. I think we need to go further, but that again will take time, and we need to build people's knowledge to get effectively to that point and secure the investment and resources to do so moving forward.
Now, two things follow from that. First, do you accept on what I've put to you, and on the assumption that what I've put to you is fair and correct, that this command decision exercise, Holcroft House, didn't test the critical features of the Lakanal incident as recommended by the coroner?
Not to the extent I would want to see as Commissioner, no.
No. And the question then that follows from that is, in addition perhaps to learning the lessons of Grenfell, did you go back over exercises such as this and ask why exercises such as this did not carry into effect fully the recommendations of the Lakanal coroner?
I think it's less about asking the question why, but recognising that we didn't have the syllabus in place. My focus has been on taking things forward, and in a way, I almost am not interested in previous kind of relationships with the contractor. I know what I need to do, and my focus has been where we've seen a gap to fill it, to just have that straightforward conversation with all parties responsible to say, we haven't got this part of the syllabus, and we unpicked every single part of high-rise training to consider what was missing, both in respect to the Lakanal house fire and the Grenfell Tower fire. And then our energy has been focused on developing the relationship where we can co-create effectively, where we move forward in partnership with the contractor and provide the sort of materials that firefighters and officers deserve, so taking it forward in a kind of construct of positivity. Certainly understanding where there were challenges and where parts of that commissioning system weren't working. Yes, absolutely.
You say, I'm sorry, did you want to finish?
No, not at all, apologies.
No, it's quite right. You say there that it's less about asking the question why, and you're not interested in the previous kinds of relationships with the contractor. But are you not interested, as part of your going forward, to understand what happened in the past, and to understand, and this is as by way of an example, why it was that this training package, the single command decision exercise, just did not carry into effect the recommendations from Lakanal, as part of understanding the organisation you're seeking to reform?
I think that we could expend a great deal of energy in unpicking every single aspect of where a training package hadn't met the requirements I would reasonably expect. I think we could do that, but actually, perhaps it would be. Perhaps I've not answered in a way that truly reflects where I am on this. Is that I very early in my tenure as Commissioner had a meeting with the corporate officers of Babcock Limited, and basically I drew a line in the sand, and my line in the sand was that we have to acknowledge, as the London Fire Brigade, that we have not always effectively acted as a commissioning client to you. You have to acknowledge that you have not always given us the best value we needed as the contractor, and that needs to stop now because of the enormity of what happened at Grenfell. And we are going to move forward recognising that we need to have a professional client-contractor relationship where we recognise the value that each of us bring to that, but also the shared responsibility. And that I actually said to them, whilst I do not intend to unpick every single example of where relationships or design should have been better, please take as a general principle that something has to change fundamentally and quickly, and you will be able to prove that to me by successfully delivering the improvements we need. And at that point, we had some very serious causes for concern laid against us in respect to driver training, instant command training, and high-rise firefighting. I think, to the credit of the contractors, they heard that, and they moved very, very quickly to respond. But I would suggest that it was a shared responsibility. A relationship on that scale, and that scale of contract, is always a shared responsibility. So I just knew that something had been wrong in the past, and we were going to resolve that, more positively moving forward. But everyone needed to be clear of their shared responsibility, because whilst we have had people unpicking all of this in detail, for example, Andy Bell's team have really deconstructed almost every element of training and professionalism in regard to high-rise firefighting. I think we could have invested a lot of energy in unpicking individual relationships, because some of this stuff will simply be down to ineffective leadership, ineffective relationships at a one-to-one level. And again, a lack of governance, a lack of oversight. And I already knew that those things needed improvement. So I think once we knew the general principle, our energy, recognising the scale of the change needed, was to focus on that and drive forward every part of the organisation and our contractor relationship against those principles.
Mm-hmm. Going back to August 2018, after the fire, a year and a bit after the fire, I showed you, I think, the first page of the document yesterday, but the Brigade published something called the Lacanal Assurance Review in the August of 2018. We can't find anywhere in that document which says, either subtly or in terms, that there was no training package at any stage which fully met the coroner's recommendation in respect of the compartmentation principle, in the same way that it had at Lacanal, i.e. mass compartmentation failure. If we're right about that omission, can you explain it, even in 2018?
No, I can't. But all I can explain is that we have gone back over every single aspect of existing high-rise training available to our crews. We have considered the lessons learned from both Lacanal and Grenfell in the construct of an entirely new syllabus, and we effectively in many ways started from scratch.
Right. So just to pin this down to a particular part of that document, to be fair to you, can we go to the assurance, please, at LFB 404801, page 29. We saw this yesterday, in fact, in the right-hand column, Action 3C, and you'll see that there is in paragraph 2 a reference to, in passing, I think, to the Holcroft House exercise, but no consideration there as to whether that exercise, or indeed any of the others, substantively addressed the purposes which it was intended to address. That's, as it were, the best we get from this document. Are you able to explain why this assurance was given?
Yes, and I better understand the question now, actually. Thank you. I think this speaks to our maturity and understanding of how you carry out effective business assurance. So I think one of the lessons I've learned as Commissioner, and it's certainly been my own understanding that's developed over time, it's not necessarily one I would have immediately arrived at on taking over, is that actually genuine assurance of outcome is complicated and has to be multi-layered. So I think what you see there is a form of assurance based on statistical analysis of completion of a training package rather than qualitative assurance of what was contained within it. And I think for many years that was the approach around assurance that the LFB took. And it is the approach we've changed fundamentally now, because whilst it's important to understand that you have the right percentage numbers of people completing a package, quite obviously it is also extremely important to understand how colleagues have experienced the package, the depth of detail in the package, whether it has met the conditions laid out in the commissioning process. And we have gone on quite a deep journey of improvement in that regard. And again, I would suggest we still need to do more, because whilst we have put in place, I think, a well-developed business assurance framework now, which is based on best practice drawn from other industries and places, culturally, we still need to catch up. We need to really help educate first-line managers, particularly about their responsibilities as regards assurance, and how it then feeds into the other tiers of assurance, for example. And I think what you have here is people, again, doing their best in terms of trying to assure the corporate body at that time that we had considered all the different aspects of kind of the Lacanal House tragedy, but they had used what was then the commonly understood kind of approach to assurance in the London Fire Brigade. And actually, my guess is that Andy Bell might have been responsible for this. And I think if you were to speak to Andy Bell today, he would tell you that in his current role he has developed extraordinarily. He has learned so much in terms of the outside expertise we've brought in to help us around assurance, and that in his role now, responsible for so much of operational assurance and our drive to progress against the recommendations from both this and inspection, he has a different view of what good assurance really means, because we have taken the time to learn from elsewhere and challenge ourselves. So I think this points to a well-intended attempt to assure ourselves that things have been done, a desire to examine ourselves, but perhaps not having the professional skills and capabilities at that point inside the LFB to really educate as to how good assurance was maybe going to be carried out.
And just one more question before the break. I think you've answered it just in your last answer, but I feel I should ask the question and give you an opportunity to tell us that that was the answer to this question. And it's this: if the LFB, on the facts, did not learn from Lakanal on the point we've been discussing, namely compartmentation, or indeed FSG calls or evacuation, and did not admit that it had failed to learn from Lakanal when it came to report in 2018, why should the public now trust the Brigade to learn the lessons of Grenfell?
I think that the public should judge us on the outcomes we deliver into London. So I don't ask for trust. I don't think we deserve to ask for trust until we demonstrate different outcomes. I think we are beginning to do that. So if you look at the fire at New Providence Wharf, which happened earlier in the year, May 2020, that was a very significant fire in a complex clad building with a failure of internal systems that meant we had to rescue 35 members of the public using new equipment, smoke hoods, employing a completely different approach to high-rise firefighting. We evacuated the block, and that was junior officers. We're talking crew managers and watch officers taking that decision at the very start of that incident to empty the block out. That I think is where we can reasonably ask the London public to trust us, because we have demonstrated in outcomes for them that we have listened, we have learnt, we have changed. My promise to Londoners is that we will continue to take that attitude forward into the future, but I would expect them to hold us to hard account. I don't want blind trust in the London Fire Brigade. I want a public that is engaged and challenging to us and questioning of us, and we need to open ourselves up to enable them to make that challenge, just as we need to enable those who reasonably scrutinise us, such as the HMIC, to point out deficiencies in our structures, our processes, our delivery, because I don't think you can run an organisation of this scale and complexity facing the challenge we do in London and get everything right. I do not expect everything is going right in the London Fire Brigade as we speak. Under my leadership, I expect the Inspectorate to find things I will need to do better. I welcome that, and we will drive the change necessary against whatever they find and whatever we find. I think it's about a different approach, a different mindset. So I think they should trust us insofar as that we are open to the possibility that we don't always get things right, that we will rapidly seek to remediate those things we either discover ourselves or others discover, and that we will continuously seek to improve, and we're beginning to see that improvement manifest in the outcomes we deliver to ordinary Londoners, whether it was by high-rise firefighting or the 600 firefighters that crewed ambulances during the pandemic and have attended 156,000 emergency incidents. I think we deserve to be and should be judged on what we deliver into the London public.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Well, I think, Commissioner, we ought to have a break at that point.
Thank you.
So we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12.
Thank you.
And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask Mr. Rowe to come back in, please? Right, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Minister.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We'll leave Incident Command and turn now to additional training topics, which we've heard evidence about in this and the last module. The first is the decision control process and the LFB's non-adoption of that. We heard some evidence about the detailed research that gave rise to it from Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton and the additional research carried out to test it and its benefits. And we know that the DCP was adopted by national guidance in July 2015, and the LFB declined to incorporate it in place of its own decision-making model. We know that. The first question for you I have is, to be clear, you don't appear to have been involved in any of the internal discussions about whether or not to adopt the DCP at the time in 2015. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Right. Now, in general terms, can I ask you, in that case, whether, in your view, that attitude to change was typical of the Brigade at the time?
No, I'm not sure that is a fair characterisation on the basis of that single issue. I think it pointed to the challenge of changing something that had been trained into the Brigade for a very long time. And I don't know the discussion behind the decision that was made at that point. But I would imagine that recognising the DCP itself has its origins in the DMM, there was probably a valid debate about whether the scale of training needed to change the approach to decision making entirely was backed by enough evidence at that point, recognising that many of the characteristics of the DCP are evolved from the DMM, share a commonality to them. So I'm not sure that is a fair characterisation in the context of that point. Could I make a point, if possible, about decision-making processes?
Yes.
So I think there has obviously been great focus on the DCP and the DMM. Can I just say, to declare my hand, I think they're both good models. I think they both have different aspects to them that are useful. So, we are incorporating the DCP into our command practice. That's part of the training and education programme we're delivering now. But I have used the DMM for most of my operational career and found it very useful, just as I've found the combat estimate in the military extremely useful. And I've got a professional interest in decision-making processes. I've looked at similar processes in health, in aviation, policing, and actually, a prime example would be the JDM in JESIP, so the Joint Decision Model in JESIP. All different, but all also very similar, secular, forcing you to take account of situational awareness, the events that are in front of you, making you think about the outcomes you want before you plan, and then building continuous review into it. So I know sometimes, for example, the DMM has been painted as linear. It's not. If you really understand the DMM, it's secular. I'm struggling to say that.
Cyclical?
They're cyclical. There you go.
Circular?
Thank you. Circular. In the same way the DCP is. I think what all of this points to is the greater question for me, and it always has been for me as Commissioner, is not so much the decision-making process you might employ as an organisation, but how you train people to use it under the moments of highest stress. Because again, if I go back to one of my answers yesterday, the difference between the training I received in the military and the training I received here in the London Fire Brigade was that the DMM was common parlance, it was understood, but no one ever really explicitly trained me to use it as a tool to mitigate the stress you might be under, whereas in the military, the decision-making process they had at the time, which has now evolved and changed again, was the combat estimate. Very simple tool, good tool. But the real value to it was that what they hammered into you was that this was the tool you were going to use to take yourself from that place of shock into a place of rational decision-making. So whilst I recognise the value of the DCP, and we are incorporating what I think is a particularly a valuable additional feature, which is it builds as a mandated part of the process an additional stage of reflection and review, which it makes an incident commander take, which isn't in the DMM, to be fair. Actually, I'm less concerned with the model because I expect models to evolve. I think the DCP will evolve. I think that our consideration of it in a high-rise environment will help provide further evidence as to its utility or need to evolve potentially. What I'm really interested in is how we take what are often very similar sorts of models, but then really train in their use to officers and crews, because I think, again, that is where I think the improvement needs to be brought.
What I'm interested really in isn't the technical content of the DMM set against the DCP in a comparative sense. What I'm really interested in knowing from you, Commissioner, is whether the failure or the decision by the Brigade not to adopt the DCP, even though it was part of national operational guidance at the time, was a paradigm for London's inability to change.
I wouldn't see it as symbolic of entirely that, because I have had long experience of national operational guidance as well. And I actually think that whilst national operational guidance, for example, is a hugely important step forward in terms of the underpinning professional knowledge and understanding available to firefighters and officers in the UK. If you look at the fact that we had this gap of so many years from what, and excuse my term, it's what they were called the manuals of firemanship, through the GRAs, which were useful but quite limited in their breadth. So I see NOG as a very useful evolution, but it's not very useful to a crew commander at 3 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes aspects of it do need challenge. It is reasonable for the largest service in the UK with the busiest operation environment to sometimes go back and say that may not work for us. We might need to consider doing something differently. I think what marks out a mature organisation, though, is the ability to go back with that constructive feedback and offer help and kind of expertise to move the national picture, potentially. Now, I can't speak as to whether that was done, and I don't know whether the example you're offering me, because I wasn't sitting at that level, is testament to a kind of absolute resistance to change. I wasn't close enough to the decision-making to really know that. So I think it'd be wrong of me to presume that was symbolic of complete resistance to change. I think what I would say is to go back to my answer from yesterday, which is that not only in the London Fire Brigade, but in the National Service, if you look at the outfall from the last 2 rounds of inspection and Sir Tom Windsor's State of Fire report, change resistance generally is a feature of the National Service, is certainly and has been a feature of the London Fire Brigade. And the origins of that change resistance are complex and multi-layered, and are driven by all sorts of things, from the experiences of industrial action to the way we promote and train leaders to systems and issues of governance, a willingness to look outside. So I think that taking a single decision as something symbolic of a much longer and complex journey around change, I find that difficult, if I'm honest.
Dr. Cohen-Hatton said, and I'll quote to you from what she said in her transcript for day 185, page 89, lines 7 to 12, that, quotes, "There is a culture in London that is very conservative. I think there is great comfort in that is familiar because it's seen as tried and tested," unquotes. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a fair challenge to make to the London Fire Brigade. I think part of the issues we've talked about over the past 2 days were that sometimes, because of the scale of our operational experience, the manifestly different risk we face as an organisation in comparison to any other service in the country, I think it sometimes allowed us to become complacent. And I think it sometimes allowed us to become slightly arrogant about our level of knowledge and understanding. And again, if I can focus on where perhaps we've tried to change that, my belief is that there are useful lessons to be learned everywhere, not only in the fire sector, but in other industries, in other organisations. And actually good organisations challenge themselves continuously as to the orthodoxies, the sacred cows they hold dear. So I think, Sabrina Cohen-Hatton's experience is real. That was her experience that she had. And I've got no doubt she's expressing that truthfully. And I would have to accept that there has been a degree of conservatism and resistance to change in the brigade, but I do not think we are unique in that. I think it is a challenge for the sector and probably speaks at root to the lack of statutory inspection, for example, for many, many years.
Turning to the question of statutory inspection, are you familiar with the fact that the Inspectorate's most recent report from February this year, 2021, noted that the LFB is the only fire and rescue service in the country, or in England at any rate, not to use the decision control process, and that position had been reviewed again by the Brigade since the Inspectorate's early report in 2019 on this point, and the decision had yet to be made. For those who want to see the reference for that, I won't pull it up, but it's INQ 30147795, page 31, first paragraph there. That's for those who want to see it. But in general terms, can I just ask you, is it still the case that a decision is yet to be made as to whether to incorporate the DCP?
No, we are incorporating the DCP into incident command practice. We're taking all those aspects of it we think are useful and building it into the practice of incident command. What I would say, though, is that at the point that report was written, we had brought in, again, in the spirit of challenge and examination, external experts in decision making to look at the evidential base of the DCP and the DMM and consider what aspects of it were useful for decision making, how we might helpfully evolve both models. And the conclusion from those experts, which were who were military in their previous careers, worked for a very large corporation focused on risk and decision making now in the US, was that actually both models lacked really good, consistent evidence over many years to really validate their positive features. So it's not that they're not good models, but actually there is simply not in the fire sector a very good body of evidence, on a scale around what good decision making looks like. And I think that's something the sector needs to develop in the future. That doesn't mean we don't think it's a good model. I do. I think Sabrina Cohen-Hatton is an expert in her field, and with the limited resources available to her, drove the best quality of research she could. But it doesn't mean it's been validated on a scale over many years across many incidents yet. And it is of interest to me that the JESIP programme, who have also had sight of the DCP, also at this point did not choose to adopt that in totality, recognised its utility of UEC aspects of it in the JDM. I think decision-making and decision-making modelling is something like other parts of operational practice needs to be under continual challenge and evolution.
Can I then turn to the second additional training topic, which is incident command revalidation and the programme. You may recall that Dr. Cohen-Hatton gave some evidence to the inquiry about that when she came to give evidence. First, did you have any personal knowledge of or involvement in the revalidation programme?
Not prior to me taking over my role as Commissioner. Since taking over as Commissioner, yes, a great deal of personal interest in that process. Right.
Do you recall whether, as part of your own experience of acting as incident commander, or indeed being monitored perhaps or commanded by colleagues when attending incidents, you were conscious of the fact that there was no system for continual assessment of command competence?
Yes.
You were. In other words, once you passed the promotional assessment, that was it.
You had refresher training, so again, it would be incorrect to say that I have not been trained by the London Fire Brigade. I've had repeated command exercise training. We did have instant command exercises, but they weren't at that point of a pass-fail nature. If you did spectacularly badly, there was a chance you would be taken off the run, that someone would unpick the development points within that. But it wasn't a systemic approach to validation of competency. But of course, that's what we've brought in now.
Yes,
it's exactly that. It is a pass-fail process. If you do not achieve 75% as a pass mark within the structured process of assessment, then depending on where you fall in a range beneath 75%, you are then put on either stopped from taking that role in command, or put on a considered individualised development programme to get you to the point where you can pass successfully at the 75% threshold. So we take a very systemic approach to it now.
When she gave evidence, Dr. Cohen-Hatton told us that all other fire and rescue services in England that she had contacted when researching her proposals for the revalidation programme already had such a structure in place. Is that consistent with your understanding at the time of the wider fire and rescue service landscape?
I think it's more nuanced than that. And I think that if you turn to the inspection reports across multiple services and the state of fire reports, that there is no service in the UK that should be complacent about how they're assessing and validating their incident commanders. So I'm not sure as a sector we, have fully matured in terms of our understanding of what it means to assess someone to a level of competency in incident command. I think there are other services that have done it better than LFB, absolutely, and we have learnt from them. But to say it was consistently applied everywhere in the UK, I'm not sure is accurate. But I would defer to perhaps Sabrina's greater knowledge on that, because she'd obviously gone out and done the work to have a look. I know when I talk to other chiefs that they grapple with the same issues, that they are very concerned about ensuring that their colleagues meet the right thresholds of kind of incident command competency, and the challenges of delivering that in a realistic simulated environment with the resources they have available. It's a continually evolving kind of discussion. That would be my analysis of it.
Does this mean that the system of revalidation was introduced under your aegis as Commissioner?
Yes.
Now, we know that the revalidation programme had not been implemented at the time Dr. Cohen-Hatton left the Brigade in November 2017, and that the Inspectorate in their 2019 inspection report noted that remained the case, but said in February this year that a system of revalidation had now been implemented. This tells us that you introduced the system. How much involvement did you personally have in introducing the revalidation of incident command?
Not the detail of it, because I wouldn't have the capacity in my role as the strategic lead of the brigade to do so, but in my very clear direction to my director of operations, our head of training, our director of people, that I expected as a priority a system of validation to be brought into place.
Are you able to?
And that needed to be robust, and we needed to see, putting it frankly, we needed to see people fail, because statistically it's clear to me that not everyone can pass, and that we should support those colleagues when they didn't meet the competency threshold to either develop because they had the potential, or be clear with them that they would never be able to hold that command position while they demonstrated the competency they had.
Do you have any insight into why the LFB appears, on her evidence at least, to have been the anomaly in not already having a system for continuing assessment of command competence at the time Dr. Cohen-Hatton picked up that initiative in 2015?
I can't, because it was something that the Brigade had recognised, actually, if I think about conversations amongst senior officers, was needed for many years. I think it speaks to organisational inertia. I think it speaks to some of the challenges of change. So sometimes I think it's presented that the Brigade is change resistant. I'm not sure that's the case. I think it's sometimes that the Brigade is trying to change everything at once. And in trying to change everything at once, rather than focusing wholly on a number of priorities, takes a long time to get things delivered. That, again, has been one of the lessons I've learned as Commissioner, is that in the desire to do everything, we recognise and accept all 66 recommendations across the inspection and the inquiry. To deliver change against those recommendations, though, has to be periodic, has to be prioritised in terms of the capacity of people to receive it, but also our capacity to design and deliver. I think sometimes, because my general experience of firefighters and uniformed officers particularly is that they're fixers, is that they want to fix 10 things at once. So I don't think it was resistance to the concept, because I've yet to meet a senior officer, and I can't think of a conversation where people haven't said, why don't we do this, and how valuable it would be. So I don't think there was resistance to it, but I'll be the first to acknowledge it took a very, very long time to get to it.
Yes, but you put that down, you say, I think, is this right, to organisational inertia as opposed to resistance to change?
Yeah, I think it's a different thing. I think it's about the ability of an organisation to plan and deliver change effectively. So that's about recognising that you need to change, but not being able to deprioritise other items of work. So if I think about the team that would have had to have delivered that, they would also have been responsible for some really fundamental policy development and change in other areas as well. So within that department, which is relatively small, you would have people who would have been working simultaneously on incident command, the development of other operational policies in respect to everything from fire survival guidance to potentially high-rise firefighting as well. So a relatively small pool of expertise who perhaps needed clearer direction about what was the immediate priority at that time. Because I've certainly never experienced in conversation, having not been directly involved in the process to deliver that, any resistance to the concept of validation. I think most officers I've ever spoken to recognise it would be both valuable and important in driving the sort of confidence and trust the public, deserve to hold the fire brigade in.
That is to say, Dr. Cohen-Hatton also told us that in addition to there being no system for command revalidation in 2015 when she picked up that project, there was also no command training at all for level 4 commanders. Can you help us why that was?
I can't explain that because, again, I wasn't involved in that decision-making process. All I can tell you is that I am the last level 4 commander to be trained in the current process. I'm going on December the 13th and the 16th to be trained and assessed. And we do now expect all our level 4 commanders to be trained in an externally recognised training environment. So that's in place.
Right. On the question of level 3 commanders, you'll remember, I think, that the Inspectorate's report from 2018 said that training for level 3 commanders was not consistently in place. Is that correct?
That was correct at the time. It is not correct now. We are above 90%, 90% of every officer group in terms of command training. So I think we're up at around 95% for all junior officers, which encompasses about 1,400 odd people, and we're above the 90th percentile for every other officer group. So level 2, which is about 244 people, I think, on current figures, and then at level 3, which is a smaller cadre, we're again well beyond the 90% mark with people having been trained, and obviously that's taken into account sickness and promotion. And then at level 4, we're bang on the 90%, and that will change to 100% when I go in December.
Can I then turn to a different topic altogether, namely fireground communications? The inquiry has heard, as you are aware, I'm sure, considerable evidence relating to communications in this part of the inquiry. Commissioner Ron Dobson, told us that it wasn't unusual for communications problems to present themselves at large incidents, and that the LFB had experience of communications problems at large incidents going back at least to the King's Cross fire in 1987. First, would you agree with that?
Yes, it's one of the key findings from 7/7, from King's Cross, from Lacanau. Communication lies at the heart of an incident commander's ability to gather situational awareness, make effective decisions, and then translate their plan into orders and briefings for the crews who invariably have to do the hard stuff.
Now, Gary Reason told us when he came to give evidence at day 182, page 30 to page 32, that the replacement of Barry radio sets was due to take place in early 2015, but hadn't taken place by the time of the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017, nor indeed, in fact, by the date of Professor Chris Johnson's report to the inquiry in November 2020. Now, that would suggest, would you agree, that the same issue we've just been discussing in relation to command training, you might call it decision inertia, perhaps, was bedeviling that problem?
No, I think this was about taking a big decision, because this was a decision that I took very early on as Commissioner, which is we needed to accept there was going to be a delay to procuring new integrated communication equipment for firefighters, because we needed to couple it with the procurement of new breathing apparatus. Incoherently, for many years, the two things have been procured in a different cycle. So you were constantly held, really, in a cycle of going back to the same supplier, effectively, or the same model. It meant we couldn't always access market innovation because you were procuring a piece of equipment that was intimately integrated with another piece of equipment separately. It made no sense. So we took the decision to stop that, to bring that back in line, and we're in the process of procuring entirely new breathing apparatus with integrated communication equipment which is at the market leading edge of what is possible, because by procuring it together you both get better value and you get the availability of all the best products on the market. Recognising there was a risk in the interim, however, we also took a big decision around intrinsic safety early on at the start of my commissionership, which was about procuring a new generation of handheld radios of a greater wattage power that still satisfied the practical need for some form of intrinsic safety, and that we would enable, in the absence of a new Barry set, those handheld radios to be used by BA crews. So, a measure which will improve communications in complex structures.
Right. What is the new wattage?
The new wattage is 4 watts.
4 watts. And when will they be delivered and rolled out to BA crews?
I would have to get the exact detail back to the inquiry. I can find out in the break, and I'll be able to give you a detailed answer on that. But it's imminent.
We can find out separately, I think, without you having to trouble yourself during the course of your evidence. Looking back, though, in history, Professor Johnson told us and explained, in fact, how buildings and construction materials can block or degrade radio signals. Both Gary Reason and Ron Dobson agreed in their evidence that was a feature of incident ground communications known to the Brigade before Lacknell, indeed. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think we've understood the challenges of complex structures and the communication within them for a very long time, from King's Cross certainly onwards.
Yes. Do you agree that there was never any real attempt to overcome or mitigate that impact following Lacknell?
No, I think people had really grappled with that question. I think the problem was, and it was one I encountered very early on taking over as commissioner, was this debate, which again is not unique to London, around what was available on the market, because there isn't a lot of useful alternatives. So we had if I think about my own decision, we debated at length what was available in the context of digital technology at the moment in the market that was reliable. Could we use Bluetooth technology? In the context of new Barry sets, actually was analogue safer? So we had a really well-informed debate even at commissioner level, and what got presented back to me was actually there was very little on the market that would improve this situation. So we ourselves went back to the market as part of procurement for the new radio sets and said, look, can we start looking at what is the reasonable limit of intrinsic safety, knowing that would give us a higher wattage? And actually Dr. Adrian Bevan, who's our head of health and safety, had to work very hard with kind of national bodies to kind of develop the understanding of what might be a reasonable point to settle on in terms of intrinsic safety, because the previous standard of intrinsic safety that had been held to by many of the fire and rescue services in the UK was developed in an American industrial context. So in the context of a large chemical plant and the sort of gaseous atmosphere you might encounter there. Now, obviously, firefighters might get called to a significant chemical incident. That could still be the case, but it's far less likely than being called to a vented high-rise fire, for example. So therefore, it's about finding the balance in a product that would give you enough intrinsic safety to reasonably go into the one environment, but just work better in the environment you were more likely to encounter in your day-to-day business in London. And that's how we settled on that wattage and the level of intrinsic safety we now decide is appropriate for firefighters in the conduct of their daily operation.
Does everything you've told us in your last answer, is all of that something that's happened during your commissionership?
I think the journey to that began prior to me taking over. So Adrian Bevan had certainly started thinking about that before I took over, because he came to me fairly early on in my role to say, look, we have got to sort this problem with radios out. We've really grappled with it, and this is what we think. Here's the recommendation to you, Commissioner, and then we had a debate.
When did he come to you?
I think we'd have to provide that information to you, but it will be clearly articulated in corporate papers somewhere. We can do that.
Right. What I'm really trying to get at is why that conversation that you've described and all the thinking and the efforts that you've described in your last answer, but one, were not undertaken in 2013. in the light of the Lacknell coroner's recommendation? Why did we have to wait for Grenfell for that conversation to happen?
I'm afraid I can't answer to that, Mr. Millett, because again, I wasn't at that level of decision making. All I know is that as Commissioner, I was very aware that I'd seen a consistent thread of criticism through inquiries, inquests, reviews that pointed, and actually from our own staff. You know, if you go to a fire station, one of the first things they're going to complain about, and I was very conscious, I'd heard it in the first phase of this inquiry, is the quality of their communications equipment and the challenges it poses to them at an operational incident. I felt we owed it to them and obviously the people they serve in London just to do something about it.
But as an agent for change, as you've just been describing to us throughout your evidence, why weren't you or aren't you interested in going back and understanding what it was about the organisation that didn't respond historically in the way that you're responding now?
I think it would be wrong to say we haven't gone back and looked. I have gone back and looked. It'd be disingenuous to say we haven't. We have. But I suppose what I took from your earlier questions was the level of detail to which we might go back into it. You know, I haven't gone back to unpick every corporate paper or try to interrogate people as to the conversations they had at that point. What we've tried to do is look back and recognise where things should have been done differently. And then, if it was particularly poignant, why things might not have been done differently. But I think that's if I think about those 66 recommendations, you know, that's two statutory processes that have delivered those recommendations. When we did our own analysis off the back of those 66 recommendations to produce a kind of transformation delivery plan at the start of 2020, and I was given a month by the Home Secretary and the Mayor to arrive at an initial plan. We had actually grown those recommendations under our own analysis to something closer to over 100. When you're faced with that spread of required change and improvement, I think you don't have the capacity to unpick every single element of why, you know, one particular thing might not have happened. I think what you have to accept when you're a leader in my position who's dealing with questions of broad strategy, intent, you know, the absolute need to hold people to good outcomes, you sort of almost have to accept the generality of it, which is we need to improve, we need to look to best practice elsewhere, we need to recognise where there's been very specific obstacles to change where it's particularly pointed. But actually I need to devote my energy and the energy of my teams to, because we owe it to the bereaved and the survivors particularly, we owe it to anyone who lives in a high-rise block in London, and we owe it to firefighters who were so courageous that night to bring that change forward. And the energy has got to be, as much as understanding the lessons of the past, looking to the future and continuously challenging ourselves to improve.
But on comms particularly, you've given us the evidence about that and the historical evidence about failure. Let me ask it this way. What is it in the changes that you've brought about in relation to communications specifically that take account of the apparently endemic failure, continuing failure, to carry into effect the recommendations of the Lacknell coroner?
I
As to ensure that that change is embedded.
I can't explain that. All I can say to you is that I think this is about culture and leadership. So I can't unpick, because for me, the reason that you would not have made that decision earlier is because there's something about the desire to question at all times. You know, I'm quite an annoying man to work for, actually, because I'm constantly questioning things. I have an inquisitive nature. I want my officers to have an inquisitive nature, not to accept what they are first presented. So I think the answer to this perhaps lies in, well, okay, the national standard for intrinsic safety commonly accepted by a fire and rescue service is this, and this is why we have arrived at this point. My starting point is always why. So I think it's as simple as that. I think it's about how you choose to lead an organisation. And if people can give you good justification as to why, you're likely to carry on. And it may well have been, you know, in defence of my predecessors, that they did ask that question and the information they were provided at the time told them that there wasn't an alternative. It may well be that in their defence they did go out and look at the market and something wasn't available. But I think it's all in the questioning. It's all in the why. And I think it's my job not to find the solution, but always to ask the question, why, when people present me something, and then demand to see the evidence that they've drawn upon to arrive at that recommendation.
As far as we're aware, I think it is right that the LFB did provide communications training following Grenfell, but that training, and it may have changed now, you have to tell me, but that training did not cover the negative impact that building and construction materials can have on radio signals. First of all, is that correct?
I'm not sure to that level of detail, to be honest, because it wouldn't have been the training I received. What I do know is we've, again, taken a fundamentally different approach to this. So, again, we've brought people in from the outside because I think there's a great focus on communication equipment, which is right, but actually the practice of how you communicate at an incident, how you build a framework for communication at an incident is equally important. So we brought in the British Army, actually, to look, because they are recognised as the preeminent experts in complex communication in a dynamic environment, and we brought them in to do a whole-scale review of our incident command communications, both equipment and structure, and how we train our people. They're clear that there are areas that we need to improve in that, and we're working on taking the learning we got from that review process that we commissioned into future training packages and a different approach to how we train incident commanders to employ all the different forms of communication they might have at their disposal, whether it's, you know, a local point-to-point airwave network or actually the reasonable use of runners if you need to. How you integrate that into something that is understood as a whole incident approach, and how we better support officers to understand and deliver that. I don't think we've got to the point of educating all our people fully enough in that. I would see that as an area of continued improvement we need to make. We haven't delivered that. You know, we need to, again, prioritise the training we're giving, and that will be something that will be very high up the priority list, and I know is built into the incident command strategy and will therefore feature in the training that's delivered moving forward.
Professor Johnson, when he gave evidence to the inquiry, described the LFB's approach to communications as a culture of making do over an expectation of technical excellence within the LFB. Would you accept that criticism of the LFB's approach to communications technology to date, or at least until the time you became Commissioner?
I'm not sure I like the phrase making do. I think that colleagues previously, we had some people who really understood comms inside the organisation. For example, I worked alongside a group commander called Jim Acor, who was our lead for instant communication. He really understood airwave. He really understood analogue communication, the operation of radios. We had a radio workshop that built and modified and maintained radios. They were experts. I think there was something, though, again, about the sharing of expert knowledge, because I think there were people within that environment who were probably frustrated about the level of kind of priority we gave instant communication and the level of training that we gave people to support it. So I don't think it was a kind of make do. I think, again, there were people in the organisation who knew it was important, but it was that piece about how do you effectively integrate that into a practically delivered schedule of training and exercising.
Well, is it? I wonder. Jim Acor was one of those responsible, you may not know this, but was one of those responsible for producing the ingredients, at least so far as communications were concerned, of the Rule 43 action plan, which was collated by Gary Reason and presented after the spring of 2013 to the Lacknell House Working Group and onward up to LFIPA through the Strategy Committee. Wasn't a question of disseminating it through into other bits of the organisation, like fire safety, for example. And we know what the outcome was of that in relation to incident ground communications. There wasn't the wholesale revolution that you're, I think, apparently describing to us this morning. So my question really is, why not?
I think, again, it's about the quality of training delivered. So I think people did recognise that it was an important aspect of incident command. And I think that, I had long discussions, if you talk about Jim Acor with Jim Acor after the Croydon tram crash, about some of the challenges of bringing into that incident a kind of integrated approach to communication, because we found it very difficult to communicate at that incident, actually, because firefighters were down in the cut. There was very poor reception on the analogue radio sets. So we put in a point-to-point digital an airwave network, a local airwave network, which worked better, but we still had to employ runners as well. But as part of the briefs I was giving at the time, I was explaining to officers, this is how we're communicating at the incident. Now, I had not been trained formally to do that. So if I was going to point to something that requires improvement, and we still have not got there yet, and I need to be transparent in that, it's that we need to train incident commanders to use all of the capabilities they have in front of them, whether human or technical, and think about communications as an absolute priority in its total sense within an incident. So I'm not sure. It's a bit like the discretionary decision-making piece. It's something we knew was important, but perhaps didn't give the depth of training required to our incident commanders, so they really saw it as part of their practice.
Now, Ron Dobson gave evidence on day 212 that because communications issues are common at all incidents, and he said, whilst we knew there were problems at Lakanal House, I don't think we believed they were extraordinary in terms of what we usually experience. In your view, and it is a view, looking back on it in your role as Commissioner, does that approach, in other words, the failure to identify communications as a specific learning point because the problems experienced at that incident were not extraordinary, tell us anything about the making-do attitude that Professor Johnson has described?
In that context, you can see why Professor Johnson may have used those words, because he I think, from the outside would view it that way. I think there probably was a level of acceptance about the challenges of communication in a very complex built environment in London and the limits of what available radio sets would give us. I think that all I can point to is my own view on this, is that I know other industries do this sometimes differently. They themselves have challenges. If you turn to the military, the first thing, that soldiers will complain about is the radios and communication. Communication in dynamic, high-risk environments is always a challenge, but therefore you should never really, in my position, be satisfied about it. And I think we will see communications, again, evolve and improve as we see a greater reliability in digital communication, for example. I think examples of us thinking imaginatively about this would be the system we've brought into control, for example, 999i, where a control operator can take over a member of the public's phone and control the phone to deliver contemporary images straight into control now from the member of the public that is, or one of our officers with a phone if necessary, that is experiencing that incident. The fire survival guidance app that we're launching right now is an example of LFB challenging itself to work with industry to bring into place a product that doesn't exist, so that an ability to transfer mass data instantly from a kind of a spreadsheet, a data set in control, in a very usable, easy to read form onto the back of a command unit or onto the tablet that is on a fire engine. So I think we're going to see, as technology evolves, the possibility of better communication at incidents as we get a more reliable digital network. So therefore it's incumbent on us to try and keep up with that and challenge ourselves in terms of the resources that are available to ourselves and our incident commanders.
Right. You refer to an FSG app. I'm quite interested in knowing a little bit more about that, perhaps shortly, not straight away. Would it be fair, though, in general, to say that at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, the LFB did not have a holistic communications policy, a holistic communications strategy, or holistic communications training?
Yes, I think we approached it in parts. So, there was a great focus on making sure people sent messages and information that was useful, relevant, succinctly, and we trained people to that, and we constantly went back to it. We were very interested in the standards that people, by the way people conducted themselves and delivered information, recognising that was important to situational awareness. So we did a lot of that, and we did that quite well, but again, could be improved. I think we talked about the challenge of communications and a holistic approach to command communication in the round in some of the training I received as a senior officer, but didn't offer really well articulated guidance about how you might get to it. We did get specific training around airwave, certainly one generation of officers, but I don't think we repeated it enough. Again, I think there was that thing about sustaining the information we gave. So at the point and it speaks to my own evidence in phase one. At the point you're asking for a repeater to be deployed into the tower at Grenfell, and you don't get Channel 2 when you want it, I think it would be incoherent of me to suggest that we were in a place we needed to be around communication, training and usage at an incident.
Now, the evidence we've heard so far suggests, I would suggest to you, that the approach of the brigade to communications equipment was perhaps limited or confused. By way of example, draw to your attention the strict insistence on 1 watt intrinsically safe Barry radios, which were undermined by the primary fallback mechanism of leaky feeders, which were not intrinsically safe. That problem I've tried to summarise just now. But would you agree that that was a problem?
Yes, I think that, again, we knew about the issue. I think that we had people inside the organisation who did understand the challenge of this, but we hadn't drawn all the different aspects that support effective instant communication together, which is, of course, why we've opened ourselves up to external scrutiny at this point and brought people in to look at it, so we can get an objective view of how we do our business in respect to communications and where we might improve.
Was this a lack of technical competence, do you think, or was it organisational inertia or scleroticism?
I think it was not incompetence. I think we had some really good radio engineers. I think we had people who understood what was available on the market and would have been able, if challenged, to go out and seek and consider all sorts of alternatives. And if they, had that opportunity, I think we might have been in a different place. I think we're back again, I'm afraid, to the issue of how you prioritise decision making, how all the different parts of the decision making mechanisms in the brigade are cited on one particular issue, and the governance in respect to risk management that supports that. Because, of course, if you have a risk management framework in place that says actually communications is coming up as a repeated issue in debrief, in inquest, in review, what are we doing about it? And it's seated on a departmental risk register that's then escalated to directorate level. Someone's going to answer the question. But I think if you're working only in a silo, sometimes you operate in an echo chamber. So if it's only going up one way, it might only come back down one way if you're working within that kind of governance structure. So I think governance and decision making and kind of the frameworks of organisations probably feel very, very dull to certainly firefighters. But I think one of the things we need to do is explain why it's so important to them and really try to bring that to life, to explain that actually what happens at my level will have a profound effect on their ability to, deliver a really successful outcome to communities. So I think we are back to that, and a lot of focus has been placed over the past 2 years to really challenging ourselves as to how we structure decision making and governance. And we're not there yet. This will continue to evolve and we'll continue to learn.
And why did the technological revolution that you've just described, FSG, apps, tablets on pumps, etc., which is, as you tell us, happened or happening under your leadership as Commissioner, not happen in 2013, 2014, 2015?
Again, I can't speak to the decision-making of previous commissioners or senior officers, although those involved in that. All I know is that my personal experience of the Grenfell Tower fire and the unimaginable impact it has had on so many families and individuals, and what it's done to my firefighters as well. They've had years now of being told that they did not do the job they should have done, and in fact it is a great mistake, I think, not to recognise that the need for improvement in the institution does not relate to the courage and endeavour of those firefighters, and it's been very difficult for them to hear this. So I absolutely owe it firstly to the bereaved and survivors who, in their dignity, and their desire for answers, have, I think, been an inspiration, really. And I owe it to Londoners because that is our job and it is our covenant and it is built into the DNA of the organisation. And we owe it to ourselves to challenge ourselves continuously. So I think the reason we've done it now is, I'm afraid, because the Grenfell Tower fire was the most terrible shock to the London Fire Brigade, because I saw firefighters and officers put in a position they should not have been put in. I saw the damage it did to that community, and I think it's not just me. I would not take the credit for any of this. I think it is through every level of the organisation there is this enormous desire to do right by the people who suffered the most, and to do right by Londoners and by ourselves. You know, to really, you know, the military again talk about a covenant with soldiers. You know, I think decent frontline firefighters and officers deserve us to honour that covenant by bringing forward these improvements.
Have you yourself had any training or education in change management?
Only in the sense that we've brought in a lot of external advisors. So we went through a process of consultation when I first took over with a well-regarded consultancy that provided training sessions to myself and all the other directors about how you might manage change. But more importantly, we brought in a change specialist at director level who is very straightforward and provides me with education on an almost daily basis, actually, in terms of what good change might look like. And we've repeated that at different points in the organisation. We've brought specialists in at different levels around change management in lots of different parts of the organisation. So, for example, we've just brought in at a more junior level a change communication specialist, because I'm afraid, I think, over the tenure of my own commissionership, this is something that we have not effectively addressed. I'm not sure that if you went to a fire station, they would always feel that we have effectively communicated change to them, nor would they have seen a lot of necessarily what we've done under the skin of the organisation or understand all of its importance. That's, I think, our responsibility at a corporate level to better communicate. As a result, we've brought in someone who does that as a specialism.
Is that Fiona Dolman?
No, that's someone who works for Fiona Dolman, but works in close coordination with the Director of Communication. So we brought someone in at a more junior level whose sole purpose is to better communicate why change is important, what we're doing, and most importantly, drive a level of engagement from the front line. Because I actually think many of the answers this inquiry is seeking are known at the front line, and people have tried to communicate them previously, and we need to enable that. We need to be better at hearing the voices of the people who are right at the coalface with communities.
And who was the well-regarded consultancy that provided training sessions?
It was called Engage, and it was led by a man called Andy Brown. Since then, we've had Accenture come and consider our target operating model and what we're going to do in terms of future development. And what I would say is that whether it's consultants, internal expertise, the help of other bodies such as the GLA or the Cabinet Office, we've turned to a lot of different people, colleagues in policing. We've turned to a lot of different people over time to challenge ourselves and try and find the best possible answers to what at times very difficult issues to progress.
And have you had advice from consultants or change management experts on how to go about training senior, I use the expression advisedly, managers in the LFB, so that they know how to delegate, how to supervise and monitor, how to report, how to operate lines of communication properly, and how to disseminate vital information laterally?
Yes, but we haven't delivered on that yet. So we're embarking on, as I've said, the biggest face-to-face leadership training programme in the history of the Brigade. So that's happening now, and it will take some time to deliver. I would anticipate 18 months to get to everyone. We are focusing on providing more support to the most senior levels of leadership, so bespoke leadership training, and that is also rolling out, and a discrete programme for middle-ranking officers as well. But they are early in their delivery, and it will take time to feel the benefit of that and the consequent impact on outcomes. I think that scale of cultural and leadership change just doesn't happen overnight. It's something that in a big organisation, again, it would be disrespectful, I think, to the inquiry to pretend that we had solved that. We haven't. It may take some years to evolve the culture of the London Fire Brigade to something that I would like to see as Commissioner.
Can I then turn to a different topic? Section 72D of the 2004 Act often calls visits, Section 72D visits. First, can I ask you, please, to look at LFB 403116. Now, this, Commissioner, may be something familiar to you from your Phase 1 evidence.
It is indeed, I'm afraid.
Yes. It's the ORD entry for Grenfell Tower as it stood at the night of the fire, and it's dated February 2017, as you can see. Now, the deficiencies of the ORD entry have been explored at length, and findings were made in Phase 1, and we're not going to go back over those. What I would want to ask you about, though, is whether, in your view and in your experience, the ORD entry for Grenfell you see on the screen here, and all its inaccuracies, was reflective of a broader problem, namely operational crews responsible for carrying out Section 72D information gathering, either not understanding or not having the time or inclination to collect and record the required information.
So I think I'd like to start firstly by saying I don't believe any fire and rescue service, but particularly not the London Fire Brigade, can deliver their duties under 72D solely through station visits. You have to take a holistic approach to 72D. Fire and rescue services discharge the 72D function through a variety of mechanisms. So, professional inspection, desktop audit of based on risk, the gathering of information from community interaction. So home fire safety visits may well give you some information that you need to be aware of. So I think we discharge our function in respect to 72D across a number of different teams, mechanisms, and that's how you build a composite risk picture, as we are required to, of what we face in London. So I think one of the things I would identify is that there was a historical reliance on discharging the function of 72D, I think perhaps too much on station personnel. So if you look at the historic policy for 72D, and please don't ask me what PORIS stands for again, but you'll see a representation of the kind of all the conditions that you might expect laid out under that kind of list in support of 72D in the policy, and an expectation that firefighters on the ground would deliver all of that analysis. Now, I don't think that's practically achievable. And if you look at the new policy for 72D, you will see that we only ask them reasonably to consider those aspects of risk that they are either professionally able to consider and that are pertinent to their role in defining the risk inherent within a premise, to guide their response. And if they identify other things that is beyond their realm of kind of knowledge, or require a different form of intervention, they should escalate that into the relevant part of the organisation. So I think that we had not always previously well supported crews to carry this function out. I think it would be wrong to pretend otherwise in the face of, what I personally experienced in the most, humiliating way, actually, in the first phase of the inquiry. To read that entry, I think stands for the issues that we faced at the point of time that this visit was carried out around crews' understanding as to what you had to do on it. It's dangerous to call it a 72D visit. I'd rather call it a premises risk assessment. But discharging part of the function of a 72D duty. And that we should have invested a greater level of training and assurance in that process to ensure that what was on the ORD was accurate, reflected the risk, and was of use to the crews themselves, because of course this was of very little use to me on the night.
Yes. Now, to be fair to you, both AC Brown and AC George had told us that the inaccuracies in this ORD were not typical of the general quality of the ORD entry across London before the Grenfell Tower fire. Are you able to comment on that, do you think?
I'm not sure that is accurate. So I undertook an exercise as AC Fire Stations, and my current Assistant Commissioner of Fire Stations has undertaken an exercise to go back over effectively every single entry on the ORD, and we found a range of inconsistencies, poor information, a misunderstanding about risk, and therefore we embarked on a mass education programme to change that. And we've had to go through 2 rounds of very, very focused assurance to get to a place where I am broadly more satisfied with the standard of entries on that database, and there is still more to do. This again will take time to affect in terms of change. I think a fairly poignant example of how we're beginning to affect that change would of course be our process to inspect all 8,000 odd high rises in London over the course of the pandemic. Because we had approached this with such rigour, what that inspection showed us was that 1,107 of those buildings could not safely maintain stay put. Now, I think that is another prime example where Londoners can trust us because they are judging us on the outcome. That showed me that our operational crews have begun to understand just how important these visits were, because they identified in the course of those thousands of inspections very serious deficiencies in the built environment and were able to escalate it. That is proof of change, but it has taken some time to get there.
Can I ask you, please, to look at LFB 000-32825? This is a briefing paper dated the 11th of December 2013 to DAC George and AC Brown from GM Elwell, Service Standard Lead SS7. And you can see in the second paragraph under the heading Background, it says this: following a request from DAC George via AC Brown to review the current quantity of ORD entries, this paper sets out to explore this issue and the underlying factors with recommendations for improvement. He is charged there with reviewing the procedures under Section 72D. It goes, I'm summarising again, rather wider than that. The first question, have you seen this document before?
Only again in preparation for the inquiry.
Right. The reason I'm asking you about it is that it appears from the presence of this document that as at December 2013, the Brigade had identified room for improvement across a wide number of areas as the management of operational risk information was concerned. And that was a matter very much on the minds of borough commanders. Historically, would you agree with that?
I think that's an accurate assessment of some of the concerns that I would have had around ORD when I assumed the post of Assistant Commissioner Fire Stations.
Right. So that was in 2016, was it?
No, I took that post after the Grenfell fire, actually, so
Right.
that would have been in December 2017. And it was an issue that I hadn't resolved to my satisfaction by the time I passed it on to my colleague Jane Philpott, who is the current Assistant Commissioner of Fire Stations. It was a work in progress. We had gone back and had to provide repeated rounds of guidance to colleagues on fire stations as to how you might best address this. We recognised that there was radical improvement needed to be made to the policy note that supported colleagues on fire stations to deliver that as well. And there was something in making sure that we really, shifted the culture. I have to say that the reason as AC Fire Stations I turned to that as one of my first priorities, and I stood in front of all the borough commanders in London and stated this, was because of my experience inside phase one of the inquiry.
You were a group manager in 2013, weren't you?
I was, yes.
Yes. Do you remember having your own concerns in your capacity as group manager at that time on the subject of the sufficiency of ORD recorded information?
No, because I held a very particular role in the London Fire Brigade. I was at that point responsible for technical rescue, so everything that involved building collapse, flood, water rescue, technical rope rescue, so all of the kind of rescue specialisms, and I was very focused really on delivering change and policy in that area. So this wasn't really relevant to my day-to-day kind of work experience. The only time I've had an intersection with this is as an operational incident commander and how useful it was or wasn't. And I have to say my experience of premises risk assessment entries was mixed. Sometimes you got a very good one, an incident, and sometimes you got a very poor one, an incident, and that being my consistent operational experience.
Did you ever draw that inconsistency to the attention of your seniors?
We had discussed it, I think, within the ORT group on more than one occasion, and I would have expected, therefore, that to have been passed via the DAC responsible for ORT into the senior leadership of the London Fire Brigade.
Right. Did you ever note any improvement?
I don't think that I ever went back to examine it as part of my role as an ORT officer. I think it was, along with our previous subject around radio communication, something that had come up more than once. But I didn't have corporate responsibility for considering the wider strategic change needed. And I have to say, I didn't go back to consider it again.
Can we look at recommendation 6 on page 3? The recommendation on page 3, at the foot of page 3, is further training is provided to all personnel with a role in the ORD process to ensure they have the skills to meet the competencies required. And if you just look at the paragraph immediately above that, it says, during the development of the service standard and at recent incidents, a number of existing ORD entries have been examined. A number of substandard examples were found. This could indicate a poor understanding of the rationale and a lack of competency based on the above list in recording relevant risk and tactical planning information at all levels of the process. WM, SM, BC, DAC. Would you agree that, looking at that, it's a fairly clear indication that there was a problem with substandard entries on the ORD in late 2013?
Yeah, and actually, it relates back to my previous answer, which is that information would only have been driven through ORT and the DIOT process. So that I think is proof that it was discussed in those meetings and that someone somewhere had commissioned someone else to do a piece of work to look at those deficiencies, because identifying that as a theme out of the back end of incident command was the role of ORT officers, to collect together, along with the team that helped manage the ORT function, all of the results from post-incident debriefs, issues of learning. So I'm presuming that John Elwell, who was a borough commander at the time, must have been commissioned to deliver that bit of work by the director of operations at the time, I would presume, or the third officer, as Dave Brown was known, in that role, or the AC service delivery fire stations. They changed the names a few times, and that would have been driven through it having been identified in an ORT meeting or a number of ORT meetings, some analysis of the IMP database, so the Incident Management Performance Database, and that would have been escalated through what was then called OPB, which was a board that considered matters of operational
Professionalism Board,
or ODCB. Again, we do, I'm afraid, like too much of an anachronism. So it would have flown through one of those processes, and then someone would have taken a decision to commission a piece of work, which is what this is. And I think it hits absolutely on the issues in regard to premises risk assessment, 7CD visits as they were known.
Can you help the panel with whether the issue identified here by Group Manager Elwell was on the LFB's radar institutionally at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
I can't, because I didn't sit at that level of corporate responsibility, but it's certainly on our radar now. It's something that we grapple with consistently, because actually there is something about how you adequately discharge this duty in London. To put this in perspective, if you think about the regulatory reform order, the old, regs as they were, as we await, the new fire safety law coming, the regulatory reform order alone encompasses 800,000 buildings in London that are considered to be of enough risk that they require, the potential to be audited. So 800,000 buildings fall within the scope. If we look at the new fire safety order and what may arise from the new building safety regulations, that number is likely to grow exponentially. We not only have over 3/4 of the high rises in the UK, residential high rises in the UK and London, we also have one of the most densely populated urban residential and commercial environments in the world. Islington is nearly as densely populated as Hong Kong, for example. So it's a constant balance of where do you look? How do you assess the risk? What do we actually get firefighters to visit? And that can't be static, because it changes with the nature of our understanding of the risk at a corporate level. It's a really difficult area of business in London, because we're 5,000 operational staff, about 1,000 a day on duty, serving a city of 10 million inhabitants. and millions of buildings. So, this is a real obsession, certainly for me, because if you get it slightly wrong, you miss an element of risk that might then later, as it did in phase 1 of the inquiry, come back to really haunt you.
I mean, listening to what you've just said, it sounds as if London is too big for one fire and rescue service.
I don't think it is. I think we are resourced to the right level for London. But it's about how you use those resources and how you intelligently and proportionately balance risk, because the vast majorities of buildings in London are not dangerous, actually. So therefore, we don't need to inspect them. It's how you, or audit them or visit them. It's how you decide where the risk is, and that's something different. So I think that we are of the right size. I wouldn't want to see us any smaller. I'll say that for the record. But I think we are broadly the right size to serve this city in terms of our latent capacity, in terms of our geographical spread. But the management of risk, regardless of, because the truth is, you could have a brigade 5 times the size and still miss the risk. It's about how you correctly analyse that picture, and that is not straightforward because there is no single data set for the buildings in London. It lies across multiple authorities, organisations, both in central government, local authorities, care providers, all sorts of people have the information you want. We don't have a single consolidated data set yet. We're working on a very large IT project called One Risk to deliver that, which will bring together both the ORD, which is the operational risk database, with Faranor, which is the fire safety risk database, and the HFSV, so the Home Fire Safety Visit database. Currently, we're still working across 3 databases, all of which can hold valuable information on one building, and should be understood as a whole. So that's where we need to get to. I'm hoping that as technology emerges, particularly cloud-based technology, we'll find our way to that somehow easier. But it is of note that when we started the building risk register process, which was mandated by central government, and rightly so, central government, in the form of, as was then DCLG, they've changed, they're DLUC now, aren't they? Informed us that they thought we had 8,005 high-rises in London. We thought that we might actually have more, but we had a record of about 7,490. As it turns out, we've now found over 8,500. So there wasn't any one single data set in regard to London. You just have to go and look. So I think we're all struggling with that. But it's less about the immediate resources available. It's about where you look and what we tell firefighters to do as a priority.
Focusing back on 72D, ex-Commissioner Dobson gave evidence on Policy 800, which is the Brigade's policy on the management of operational risk information, published first, I think, in 2012. And he told us at day 211, page 207, lines 8 to 16, for those who want to see it, that in his recollection, the policy made the process of 72D visits, as he called them, and the collection of operational risk information, quotes, too complicated, unquotes, for station-based crews, and was, quotes, unrealistic in what was expected of them. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I would.
You would. And do you think that the problem of apparently inadequate ORD entries, such as the one I showed you for Grenfell Tower, was the result of a policy that was simply too complicated and unrealistic for station-based staff?
Yes, I would in part, but I think it's also that we also didn't train effectively to that policy. They might have had a better chance at delivering it if we'd actually sat down repeatedly with them and enabled them, because we've got lots of really intelligent, well-skilled people sitting on fire stations who I think actually would be capable of working through that flowchart process. I think it was overcomplicated, and the new version is simpler. But actually, to carry out a premises risk assessment properly in some buildings is quite complex. It's why we have delivered fire safety training now to every single firefighter in London. It's not just about the fire safety advice they provide in a defined fire safety visit. It's also going to help their knowledge in terms of carrying out a premises risk assessment for a different purpose, for example. So I think there's something about the underpinning knowledge we gave people as well. It wasn't just about the process and the policy, it was about how we supported people to deliver it.
And what is the content of the training now that is being delivered to station-based staff on the collection of information about premises and the analysis of the risk presented thereby?
Well, it's based on the change policy, and it is about sitting and talking through with crews how you deliver that visit. Again, I think we will need to seek to continue to improve that. We won't stand still on that, and I hope as we deliver fire safety knowledge to a greater depth in the fire brigade, our competency in this area will continue to evolve. I think the real key to this, though, is not just to provide the training, but we're back to assurance, which is you've then got to go and have a look at the end results and really satisfy yourself that anything we have done actually changes the endpoint. What I do know, because of the rigour with which Jane Philpott in particular has approached this as our AC fire stations, is that we are seeing a markedly improved standard in ORD entries, which tells me that people are taking this more seriously. But I would not encourage any complacency in this area, because there will still be entries on that database that I would not be satisfied with. This is the reality of a big organisation comprised of 5,000 human beings, some of whom do not always discharge their function to the standard I would like. So we keep on going back round that loop of education, delivery, assurance, challenge, change the training again, which, to be fair to Ron Dobson, is how he originally conceived the DIOP process.
Is anybody actually, or has anybody actually done an audit of the ORD database to weed out the substandard entries?
Yes, on more than one occasion now over the past 2 years.
If that's
We're back in and out of it continuously, but don't forget this shifts. If you were to look outside even the window now, the scale of construction in London is still extraordinary. So the built landscape is changing, and I would expect in terms of managing that prioritisation that things come on and off that list. The ORD should be a live, document, a live database, because you will find that, one of the things we found was that, there had not been enough removal of things from the ORD when we first went to audit, because although the buildings might be there was different usage or they represented a different risk. So actually I would expect these things to flex, and obviously as new buildings are built or occupied in a different way and therefore represent a different risk, you're going to get new entries. Some of those entries will be to a standard I'm satisfied with, increasingly so, but some still will not. Maybe it's a junior officer that hasn't yet had the benefit of all that education to the depth we want. Potentially it's someone who's not having their best day at work. That's the reality of big organisations. I think the key is to recognise it can happen and then challenge yourself to go back round that loop to, as far as possible, drive a consistent and highest possible standard of any activity.
Yes. You mentioned earlier in your evidence the two different databases, the ORD and Farinor. ORD from what you might call 72D visits, and Farinor being the work product or information database derived from information from enforcement under the RRO, as I believe. We heard some evidence from AC Dan Daly about that, and he told us that the flow of information did not work well between the two and was patchy, inconsistent. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
And why was that?
Because the two systems are not directly aligned. You're relying on the sharing of data between the systems that is not intuitive or technically straightforward. So you're relying on the human factor here. There's an element of human intervention to take data from one place to another. So that's one of the main reasons for why we're seeking to evolve our holding of data in a single place. Now, it might mean that we still maintain the three separate databases, but emerging technology shows us that you can interrogate those three separate databases through a mechanism to bring it into conglomerate. It might be that we have to build one single whole database. I wait to see how that develops, but it's complex because of the volume of information held in both, and the fact that at the moment, you really do need to support that transfer of risk information through human systems as well. There's not a straight pass across.
When you became commissioner, was it a particular concern of yours that the ORD did not capture the full picture of all high-rise buildings in London?
Yes.
Yes. And do you agree with AC Dave Brown's evidence that the ORD should, in fact, record all residential high-rise buildings or at least the vast majority of them?
In the context of what we currently understand to be the risk, yes. If we got to a place where we remediated the vast majority of those buildings, and we were in a place where constructors started to build buildings that were genuinely safe, then we might find actually that we didn't need every high-rise. That's a good example of where things might come off the ORD. But you would have to have a great level of assurance in the quality of construction and the remediation works that have been carried out at that point to take that decision. As it currently stands, there is no way we could do that because of what both this inquiry, our own analysis, and the kind of understanding from residents themselves has demonstrated around safety in the high-rise environment, which is we are nowhere close yet to ensuring that is safe for all London residents living in a high-rise.
Now, the Lacanal Assurance Review from the 7th of August 2018, and as I say, I don't need to take you to it unless you would like me to, tells us that as at October 2017, some 1,700 residential high-rise premises had a premises risk assessment recorded against them out of a total of 6,900 known residential high-rises in London. When Dave Brown gave evidence in the last module, he suggested that those figures were inaccurate, but he wasn't in a position to advance any alternative numbers. First of all, are you in any better position than he is?
I'm not in a position to advance any greater understanding around historical progress against inspection of high-rise as we understood it at that point, no.
Would you agree that 1,700 out of 6,900 is a poor hit rate?
Yes, particularly because there was an intent to visit all of them post-Lacanal.
And has there been an improvement in those numbers or numbers like them since October 2017?
Yes, vastly. So I know that at least that we're up close to 8,000 for premises risk assessment entries, ORD entries, and where relevant, we have over 7,500 electronic premises information plate entries. So we've got to a point because we've looked at 8,500 high rises over the course of the building risk review process. We've ensured that as far as we know it, and don't forget these numbers change almost daily, that we have captured the vast majority of high rises in London. But that is a continuous process. You're in a continuous cycle there.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, is now a convenient moment?
Yes, does that suit you?
Yes, it does.
Yes, well, I think it's time we had a break for lunch, Mr. Rowe. We'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence over the break. All right. Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher then, please? Thank you very much. 2 o'clock then, please.